Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The moment I stepped into the attic, I knew something was wrong. Not structurally. I'm a civil engineer. I would have recognized failing support beams or compromised load-bearing walls. This was different. The massive industrial building had stood abandoned for nearly 30 years before developers purchased it for conversion into luxury lofts. My job was simple: inspect, document, verify. Yet as the heavy access door slammed shut behind me with an unexpected finality, the air around me seemed to condense, as if the space itself was breathing. The reinforced concrete attic stretched before me, a forest of thick support columns disappearing into shadows. My flashlight carved weak pathways through darkness that felt almost viscous. The beam couldn't penetrate more than 15 feet ahead, though the ceiling-mounted emergency lights should have provided adequate illumination. 3 of them flickered weakly, casting more shadows than light, while the rest remained dark. According to the building plans tucked under my arm, this level shouldn't even exist. The blueprints showed only a crawl space for maintenance access, not this vast concrete labyrinth. I checked my phone. No signal. Of course. 18 inches of reinforced concrete above and below would block any reception. My colleagues weren't expecting me back at the office for hours, and the construction crew had left for the day. The developers wanted this inspection completed today, not tomorrow, which meant I was entirely alone in this massive structure. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry, and began taking measurements. The first abnormality I noted was the temperature. Despite being late summer and the lower floors sweltering without air conditioning, the attic was unnaturally cold. My breath fogged in front of me as I documented ceiling height and structural integrity. The digital thermometer on my equipment bag read 48 degrees. Impossible for an enclosed space in August without active cooling systems. I marked it down, attributing it to some quirk of airflow or thermal properties of the thick concrete. 30 minutes into my inspection, I found the corridor. It wasn't on any blueprint or renovation plan. A narrow passage, barely wide enough for my shoulders, cut between 2 massive concrete support walls. Unlike the rest of the open attic space, this corridor was enclosed, with a low ceiling that forced me to duck slightly. The moment I stepped into it, I felt it, a vibration. Not the mechanical hum of equipment or the subtle tremor of distant traffic. This was something I'd never experienced before. The air itself seemed to vibrate at a frequency just below hearing, a pressure that made my eardrums ache and my teeth feel loose in their sockets. At each end of the corridor stood identical metal doors, their surfaces covered with rust patterns that resembled intricate circuit boards or ancient writing. As I watched, the door to my left creaked open about 2 inches, then slowly closed again. No draft moved through the space. The air was completely still except for that persistent vibration. I approached the door cautiously, running my hand over the surface. The rust came away on my fingers, not in flakes but as a fine red powder that stained my skin like dried blood. My equipment detected no airflow, no temperature differential that could explain the door's movement. I made a note to recommend complete replacement of these doors during renovation, though something told me the developers would prefer to simply seal this corridor entirely. That's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound behind me. I turned, expecting to see a rat, or perhaps some debris falling from the ceiling. Instead, my flashlight illuminated a set of wet boot prints on the concrete floor. They hadn't been there moments before. The prints began about 10 feet behind where I stood and led directly toward me, stopping about 3 feet away. Water still glistened on the concrete, as if someone wearing soaking wet work boots had just walked through. Someone invisible. My heart slammed against my ribcage. I backed away, scanning the empty corridor. The logical part of my brain, the engineer's mind that had gotten me through a decade of structural analysis and safety inspections, searched desperately for an explanation. A leaking pipe above, perhaps, dripping in a pattern that resembled footprints. But there were no pipes overhead, only solid concrete, and water doesn't form perfect boot prints. complete with treads and a worker's size 12 dimensions. As I watched, another print appeared on the dry concrete, then another, and another. Slow, deliberate steps coming toward me. The invisible walker was now close enough that I should have felt breath on my face, should have bumped into a solid body. But there was nothing. Nothing but those wet prints appearing one after another on the bone-dry floor. I stumbled backward, colliding with the rusted door. It didn't budge. When had it locked? I couldn't remember hearing a mechanism engage. The wet footprints stopped advancing, and for one blessed moment, I thought the phenomenon had ended. Then the voice began. Low and gravelly, it emerged from the concrete walls themselves, as if the building's very structure had found a way to speak. The words were clear but made no sense. A stream of construction coordinates and structural specifications for projects that couldn't possibly exist. Load-bearing column, coordinates 47.623 degree on, 122.1142 degree albedo, 42 inches diameter, poured September 19, 1977, contractor unknown. I recognized the format. It was how engineers logged critical structural elements. But the location coordinates placed this phantom project somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, thousands of miles from where I stood. And the date. 1977 was during this building's original construction, but the contractor was well documented. Westlake Industrial Development. There was no unknown about it. The voice continued, describing foundations never poured, steel never forged, concrete never mixed. With each recitation, the vibration in the air intensified until my vision blurred. My digital measuring tools went haywire, screens flickering between impossible readings, negative pressures, temperatures below absolute zero, radiation levels that should have killed me instantly. I needed to leave. Now. I pushed away from the door and moved toward the corridor's entrance, back to the main attic space. But something was wrong. The passage stretched before me, longer than before. What had been a 20-foot corridor now extended at least 50 feet. The exit a distant rectangle of dimly lit attic. I broke into a run, my boots pounding the concrete, the sound echoing unnaturally. After 30 seconds of sprinting, the exit should have been reached. Instead, it seemed even farther away. The corridor was expanding, stretching like taffy with each step I took. Sweat drenched my shirt despite the cold air, and my lungs burned. The voice grew louder, now joined by others. A chorus of phantom engineers reciting phantom projects, their words overlapping into a cacophony of technical jargon that somehow carried the cadence of an incantation. I stopped running. Obviously, this approach wasn't working. The rational part of my mind, the part still desperately clinging to physical laws and structural engineering principles, suggested I was experiencing some form of hallucination. Carbon monoxide poisoning, perhaps, or oxygen deprivation. Maybe an undocumented chemical leak from the building's industrial past. But another part of me knew better. The coppery taste of fear coated my tongue as I turned to look back the way I'd come. The wet footprints had multiplied, dozens of sets now, all different sizes, all leading toward me from a door that shouldn't exist at the end of a corridor that couldn't exist. I pressed my back against the wall and closed my eyes, focusing on my breathing. My hands trembled as I pulled out my digital recorder, determined to document whatever was happening, even if only to prove to myself later that I hadn't completely lost my mind. When I opened my eyes, the corridor had changed again. The walls now bore faded markings, architectural annotations, construction notes, and calculations scrawled directly onto the concrete. I approached one section and ran my fingers over the surface. The markings were carved into the concrete, not written on it, the grooves packed with that same rust-red powder I'd found on the door. I recognized some of the calculations, load distributions, tensile strength assessments, subsidence predictions, but they were wrong. Fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. Any structure built according to these specifications would collapse immediately, killing everyone inside. Yet mixed among these fatal errors were brilliant innovations I'd never seen before, construction techniques that shouldn't be possible with current technology. The voice from the walls had changed too. It was speaking directly to me now. Inspector Warren Mitchell, Structural Assessment of Kenton Industrial Complex, August 17, 2025. Subject terminated inspection at 4:47 p.m. after exposure to non-standard architectural anomalies. My blood turned to ice. That was my name, today's date, the exact project I was working on. But I hadn't terminated anything, and it certainly wasn't 4:47 yet. I checked my watch. 4:46 p.m. The second hand ticked forward. 4:47. At that exact moment, every emergency light in the attic went dark. Complete darkness enveloped me, so absolute I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it was dead too. In the darkness, I felt something brush against my shoulder, something solid yet insubstantial, like fingers composed of static electricity. The whispering intensified. Multiple voices now, all speaking in that same technical language of construction and engineering, but twisted, wrong. They described how the building had been constructed, not with concrete and steel, but with something else. How certain structures weren't designed to provide physical support, but to contain something that existed between spaces. How the anomalous readings I detected weren't malfunctions, but measurements of something bleeding through from elsewhere. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered back to life of its own accord. The beam illuminated a single sheet of blueprint paper lying on the floor before me, a paper I hadn't dropped. I picked it up with shaking hands. It was the original construction plan for this building, dated 1977, but notably different from the copies I'd studied. This version showed the attic level in detail, including the corridor where I stood. In the margins were handwritten notes that made my skin crawl. Boundary unstable in this section. Temporal displacement observed during concrete pouring. 3 workers lost during final phase. Corridor sealed as containment measure. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Whatever was happening here had happened before. The building hadn't been abandoned due to economic downturn as the developers claimed. It had been abandoned deliberately, and now the renovations were disturbing something that had been carefully contained for decades. As this realization dawned, the wet footprints surrounding me began to dry and fade, disappearing one by one. The vibration in the air subsided. The corridor, which had seemed endless moments before, now appeared as it had originally, short, straight, unremarkable. When I looked down at the blueprint again, it had transformed into my own inspection notes, the disturbing marginalia replaced by my mundane observations about ceiling height and support beam placement. I made my way back to the attic's exit, moving quickly but forcing myself not to run. Every step felt like walking through molasses, my body leaden with exhaustion and residual fear. Nothing further manifested. No voices, no footprints, no impossible architecture. When I finally pushed through the access door and descended to the main building, everything appeared normal. Sunshine streamed through tall industrial windows. My phone regained signal immediately. 3 missed calls from the development company, wondering about my assessment. I should have told them the truth, that the attic level needed to remain sealed, that the renovation should be abandoned entirely. Instead, I reported structural issues that would make conversion economically unfeasible without mentioning what I'd experienced. Numbers don't lie. Concrete doesn't deceive. My fabricated structural assessment would ensure the building remained empty. Later that night, as I transcribed my actual experiences into a private journal, I noticed something odd about the digital recordings I'd taken. Between my spoken notes were long periods of static, punctuated by faint voices discussing construction projects that never existed, and one additional voice, speaking directly into the microphone when I knew I'd been alone. "They always send engineers," it said. "They think they understand how buildings work, how spaces connect, how structures contain. They never realize they're just creating more doors." The next day, I resigned from the project. The week after that, I resigned from civil engineering altogether. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. And some spaces, I now understand, were never meant to be converted, renovated, or occupied by the living. I still dream about that corridor. In my dreams, I'm still walking through it, and it's still expanding before me. Only now, I'm leaving wet footprints behind me as I walk. Story 2. The leather tore under my fingers like wet paper, revealing not the expected horsehair stuffing, but something darker, a cavity that exhaled a briny smell of ancient seawater. My restoration workshop suddenly felt colder. The Victorian armchair had arrived 3 days ago, its mahogany frame solid, but its upholstery slashed as if by great claws. As I peeled back another strip of damaged leather, the chair trembled beneath my touch. Not the gentle vibration of a loose joint, but the distinct rhythm of something contained, something waiting. I'm Thomas Mercer, a furniture restoration specialist focused on 19th century pieces. I've spent 15 years bringing antiques back from decay's edge. My workshop occupies the basement of a century-old building in Portsmouth. Fitting, given the maritime history embedded in most pieces I restore. My reputation for discretion and skill brings clients with unusual requests, but nothing prepared me for what arrived with this Victorian monstrosity. The delivery men had struggled with it despite its unremarkable size. They complained about unexpected weight shifts as if the chair were redistributing itself in their grip. I dismissed their concerns as the typical grumbling of underpaid workers. When they left, I examined my new project under the harsh workshop lights. A gentleman's fireside armchair, circa 1870, upholstered in cracked burgundy leather with brass studs along the rolled arms. Distinguished, if not for the violent damage to its seat and back, parallel gashes that suggested something had fought to escape from within. The client, a Mr. Blackwood, had provided minimal information. According to his notes, the chair had been salvaged from a coastal manor slated for demolition. The property had belonged to a sea captain who disappeared in the 1890s. Restoration instructions were equally sparse. Repair the upholstery while preserving as much original material as possible. Routine work, or so I thought. That first night, as I measured the damage and made material lists, I noticed the chair's odd temperature, cooler than the surrounding air, as if resisting the workshop's warmth. My fingers traced the tears, following their violent arcs. The deepest gash revealed a glimpse of something not belonging in Victorian furniture, a waterlogged document, its ink barely legible. I extracted it carefully, finding a ship's manifest dated 1889. Captain Everett's final voyage manifest listed standard cargo, but a handwritten note in the margin caught my attention. Salvage operation successful. Specimen secured. I set the paper aside to dry, planning a more thorough examination later. As I returned to the chair, my thumb caught on something sharp protruding from the stuffing. I pulled it free. A fragment of something hard and iridescent, curved like a claw or scale, yet with the pearlescent quality of shell. Under my work light, it seemed to pulse with inner luminescence. I placed it in a specimen jar, noting its odd weight and the way it appeared to shift color as it caught the light. That night, I locked up as usual, but sleep proved elusive. My dreams filled with dark water and distant scraping sounds. I awoke at 3 a.m., certain I'd heard movement from the workshop below. The sound stopped as I descended the stairs, flashlight in hand. Everything appeared undisturbed, except the chair, which had moved approximately 6 inches from its previous position. I told myself I'd forgotten its exact placement and returned to bed, though sleep remained a stranger until dawn. The following morning, coffee in hand, I examined the document more carefully. Beyond the manifest was a journal entry describing a salvage operation off the New England coast. Captain Everett wrote of a shipwreck unlike any he'd encountered. Not wood and canvas, but something organic and shell-like. His crew had retrieved artifacts that defied classification, including components that continued to move independent of human touch. The final entry mentioned securing these specimens in custom furniture for transport to a university contact. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic toward the entry's end, describing strange illnesses among the crew and sounds emanating from the specimens that no human throat could produce. I should have stopped there. Any rational person would have contacted the client and refused the project. Instead, I felt an inexplicable compulsion to continue, a professional fascination with the mystery presented. I told myself it was nothing more than a sea captain's delusions or elaborate hoax. That afternoon, I began preliminary repairs, removing the damaged leather to access the frame beneath. The chair's stuffing revealed more oddities, sections of conventional horsehair interspersed with fibrous material resembling sea kelp, preserved but still somehow moist. Beneath this layer lay a second, more troubling discovery, a latticework of something resembling cartilage rather than wood, forming a secondary framework within the chair's conventional structure. The pattern reminded me of rib cages or the interior of certain shellfish, but scaled to human proportions. My restoration work typically provides a meditative calm, but each hour with this chair increased my unease. The workshop's familiar smells of wood polish and hide glue receded beneath the intensifying brine odor emanating from the chair. The building's usual creaks and settling sounds seemed to synchronize with my movements, as if something were mimicking me from within the walls. When evening fell, I noticed a fine dust on the floor around the chair, not sawdust or leather particles, but something resembling sand or crushed shell. I swept it into a pile, and under my magnifying glass, the particles appeared to move microscopically, reorganizing themselves when left undisturbed. I sealed a sample in another jar, placing it beside the shell fragment. That night I stayed late, determined to make progress. The storm outside provided an appropriate soundtrack, rain lashing the windows and wind howling through the building's ancient ventilation system. Around midnight, the power flickered, leaving me in darkness broken only by lightning flashes. I fumbled for my emergency lantern, and in its weak glow, I swore the chair's surface rippled. Subtle movements in the remaining leather, like muscles twitching beneath skin. I approached cautiously, lantern extended. The leather continued its microscopic undulations, and as I leaned closer, the chair emitted a sound. Not the creak of settling wood, but something disturbingly similar to respiratory effort. The leather expanded and contracted in a rhythm matching human breathing. My own breath caught in my throat, heart hammering against my ribs as I backed away. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Air pressure changes from the storm, residual flexibility in the antique leather, my own exhaustion creating hallucinations. As the lantern's batteries weakened, I decided to leave. Gathering my coat, I glanced back to find the chair had silently repositioned itself between me and the exit. The distance wasn't great, perhaps 3 feet from its previous position, but I had touched nothing. On the concrete floor, barely visible in the dying light, spiral patterns trailed from the chair's feet. Fine, continuous lines like those a snail leaves on garden stones. My hands trembled as I edged around the chair, maintaining distance as if approaching a wild animal. The leather seemed to track my movement, the tears in its surface widening slightly as I passed. Outside, I sat in my car until my breathing normalized, rain drumming on the roof as I convinced myself I was overreacting to coincidence and fatigue. Sleep came fitfully that night, punctuated by dreams of dark water and glimpses of massive shapes moving beneath waves. I woke repeatedly, each time certain something was scraping at my bedroom door. Morning light revealed nothing unusual, but my apartment felt different somehow, as if something had cataloged its contents in my absence. I considered contacting Mr. Blackwood to decline the project, but curiosity overrode caution. Instead, I visited the university library, researching shipwrecks off the New England coast circa 1889. I found references to the Wilhelmina, a research vessel that disappeared under mysterious circumstances, its wreckage never recovered. More disturbing were documents describing a quarantine at Blackwater Harbor the same year, a small port town that ceased to exist after authorities blockaded it, following reports of an unknown contagion. Newspaper archives contained a single photograph of the harbor during quarantine, showing military personnel examining something captured in fishing nets. The image too blurred to identify, but distinctly non-human in its proportions. The library's maritime collection included a journal from a lighthouse keeper stationed near Blackwater. His entries described living hulls crawling from the waves at night and shells that moved independently of their occupants. Local authorities had dismissed his accounts as delusions from isolation, but his detailed sketches showed creatures combining crustacean and cephalopod characteristics at impossible scales. The final pages contained increasingly paranoid writing about infiltration and mimicry, claiming the creatures could adopt aspects of their surroundings or hosts. The journal ended abruptly 3 days before the quarantine began. I returned to my workshop with growing apprehension. The chair waited, seemingly unchanged, though I couldn't shake the impression it had oriented itself toward the door in anticipation of my return. The leather appeared drier, tighter across the frame, with new cracks forming patterns reminiscent of the lighthouse keeper's sketches. The briny smell had intensified, mingling with something else. A musky animal odor I associated with predators at the zoo. Determined to complete at least the documentation phase, I photographed the chair from multiple angles. Later, reviewing the images on my computer, I noticed discrepancies between photos taken seconds apart. Subtle shifts in the chair's position, variations in the pattern of tiers, differences in the texture visible through the gashes. In one image, something appeared to peer from the deepest tier, something reflective and segmented, like a compound eye partially concealed by the leather. That night, I encountered another document hidden deeper in the chair's structure. A letter from Captain Everett to a Professor Hargrove at Miskatonic University. The captain described capturing something, neither plant nor animal, yet possessing characteristics of both, after tracking bioluminescent phenomena offshore. He reported the specimen was dormant when retrieved, but reactivated during transport, necessitating containment within constructed organic matrices to prevent escape. The letter ended with an urgent request for specialized equipment, claiming conventional tools passed through the specimen's tissues without lasting effect. I examined my restoration tools with new unease. The chair had begun making sounds when the workshop was otherwise silent. Not creaking, but a wet, organic sound like thick liquid moving through valves. When I approached with my leather knife, the chair went silent, the surface tension in its upholstery increasing visibly. My professional pride still insisted on completing the project despite mounting evidence that I was dealing with something beyond conventional explanation. I developed a compromise approach: repair the external damage while avoiding deeper intervention in the chair's structure. This decision reflected both self-preservation and growing certainty that whatever resided within the chair was still, in some capacity, alive. I worked exclusively during daylight hours, keeping tools with sharp points within reach. The chair's behavior intensified, its movements no longer limited to nighttime repositioning, but now including subtle adjustments while I worked, as if testing my awareness threshold. The leather beneath my hand sometimes yielded like flesh rather than hide, and more than once I caught glimpses of movement within the tiers, something iridescent and jointed withdrawing from light. The spiral patterns on my workshop floor expanded daily, forming intricate geometric designs that radiated outward from where the chair stood each morning. I began taking photographs of these patterns, noting their resemblance to mathematical sequences found in certain marine organisms. The chair seemed to be mapping my workspace through these markings, each day's pattern extending further toward my tools, materials storage, and eventually, the stairs to my apartment. Last night marked the culmination of my experience with the chair. I had completed the external repairs, replacing damaged leather with period-appropriate materials, while carefully avoiding the deeper structure. As I applied the final coat of conditioner, my hand brushed against something that hadn't been there before. A small shell-like protrusion emerging from the seam along the chair's arm. Before I could examine it, the protrusion retracted, and the entire chair shuddered beneath my touch. I stepped back, watching in horrified fascination, as the chair's leather surface began undulating rhythmically. The newly repaired sections bulged outward, stretching the stitches I'd so carefully placed. From within came sounds no furniture should make, clicks and burbles reminiscent of tide pools at night. The spiral patterns on the floor began extending visibly, carved by invisible appendages beneath the chair. My paralysis broke when the largest tear, now repaired with my strongest stitching, began to split open again. Not randomly, but with the precision of deliberate incision. Within the widening gap, something glistened with the iridescence of abalone shell, but structured like interlocking plates of armor. A protrusion emerged, jointed and articulated like a crab's limb, but with unsettling flexibility. It extended toward my workbench, specifically toward the jar containing the fragment I'd removed earlier. Self-preservation finally overcame curiosity. I backed toward the exit, but as I moved, so did the chair. Not by inching across the floor, but by sudden, scuttling movement that carried it between me and the door in an instant. The leather now bulged from multiple points, the mahogany frame creaking as something within redistributed its mass. The smell of seawater became overwhelming. Not the clean scent of open ocean, but the rotting brine of deep trenches where sunlight never reaches. In desperation, I grabbed a restoration solvent, highly corrosive to organic materials, and flung it at the chair. The effect was immediate and terrible. The leather sizzled on contact, and from within came a sound no human vocal apparatus could produce. A high, oscillating shriek that vibrated the glass jars on my shelves. The chair convulsed, its wooden frame splintering as something beneath the upholstery thrashed in apparent agony. Taking advantage of the distraction, I bolted for the door, glancing back only once to see the chair's form collapsing inward, its structure dissolving into something less recognizable as furniture and more resembling a partial exoskeleton. Through the widening gaps in its surface, I glimpsed movement, segmented appendages withdrawing deeper into the chair's interior as the solvent continued its work. I spent the night in a hotel, returning only at midday with a colleague, a furniture conservator whose scientific skepticism I hoped would provide rational perspective. We found the workshop undisturbed except for the chair, which had returned to apparent normalcy. Damage from the solvent evident, but not catastrophic, and all signs of movement or organic components gone. The spiral patterns remained on the floor, however, extending to every corner of the room and up the walls in places, forming a complex map of my workspace. My colleague found nothing to support my wild account, suggesting my isolation and work stress had resulted in parasomnia or hallucinations. The chair, to his examination, was merely an unusual Victorian piece, with evidence of amateur repair attempts and water damage consistent with salvage from a coastal property. I've since moved the chair to a storage unit while deciding my next course of action. Mr. Blackwood remains unreachable at his provided contact information, and my research into his identity has revealed troubling connections to fringe marine biology organizations with questionable scientific practices. The documents I recovered from the chair are now sealed in waterproof containers, their contents raising more questions than answers about what Captain Everett might have retrieved from the depths. Sometimes at night, I wake to the sound of something scratching at my apartment door. Not the desperate clawing of a trapped thing seeking escape, but the methodical, patient scraping of something mapping its surroundings, learning and adapting. I've begun finding spiral patterns in unexpected places, condensation on my bathroom mirror, frost patterns on my windows, even the arrangement of my belongings when I return home, subtly reorganized in geometric progressions. Yesterday, I received a package containing a commission request for additional restoration work on related items from the Everett collection, including a writing desk, a wardrobe, and a 4-poster bed frame, all reportedly salvaged from the same coastal property. The letterhead shows a spiral pattern identical to those carved on my workshop floor. I haven't decided yet whether to accept. Story 3. The spotlight cut through the darkness like a knife, its beam catching dust particles that danced in the air, except there shouldn't have been any power to make it work. I stood frozen in the center of Hangar 14, my camera hanging limp from my neck, as the massive WW2 searchlight pivoted on its mount without a sound, without a cable, without any rational explanation. The metal beneath my boots seemed to vibrate at a frequency just below hearing, more a feeling than a sound, like the phantom rumble of engines that had been silent for decades. I've always been drawn to abandoned places. As a photographer specializing in forgotten military aircraft, I've spent countless nights in decommissioned bases and forgotten airfields across the country. But Millerton Air Base was different. The moment I stepped through the rusted doors of Hangar 14, something had felt wrong. A coldness that penetrated deeper than skin. A silence that seemed to have weight and substance. The airfield's caretaker had warned me about the place with a strange detachment in his voice. When I'd asked about access to the hangars for my photography project on B-17 maintenance facilities, his weathered face had twitched almost imperceptibly. He'd eventually agreed, handing over a ring of massive keys and mumbling that nobody ever requested to visit Hangar 14, especially after dark. I had dismissed it as the ramblings of a lonely old man who'd spent too many years listening to the wind howl through empty buildings. Now, as the beam swung around again, I wasn't so sure. The light caught the concrete floor, revealing a series of overlapping circular marks. Not the linear skid marks I'd expect from landed aircraft, but perfect circles, like something had descended straight down. I pulled out my research materials, flipping through the facility's declassified layouts. There was no record of vertical landing capabilities here, nothing that would explain these marks. My heart rate quickened slightly as I photographed the patterns, the mechanical click of my vintage camera unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. When the spotlight beam completed its rotation and passed over me again, something impossible happened. The air above my head compressed and displaced, pushing down with enough force to make my knees buckle slightly. My ears popped from a sudden pressure change, and I instinctively ducked as if something massive had just passed overhead. Something I could feel but not see. Sweat broke out across my forehead despite the November chill. I backed away, my boots scuffing against the concrete as I moved toward what should have been the safety of the wall. The beam continued its slow, mechanical rotation, sweeping across the empty space where World War II bombers had once been maintained and repaired. My hand fumbled for my flashlight, its beam pathetically small compared to the powerful searchlight. The spotlight paused briefly on a section of the floor about 20 feet away from me, and I noticed something peculiar. The dust in that area was disturbed in a way that almost resembled footprints. Not the solid impressions of a person walking, but something lighter, as if the very concept of a footprint had been suggested rather than imprinted. My rational mind fought to maintain control. Dust patterns formed by air currents, I told myself. Old buildings had strange acoustics. The pressure changes were probably from broken ventilation systems coming to life in forgotten corners of the massive structure. The circular marks on the floor must have been from equipment long removed, their purpose forgotten in redacted files. Yet none of these explanations accounted for the spotlight functioning without power. I approached the light itself, careful to avoid stepping directly in its beam. The massive apparatus stood on its original mount, a relic from when this facility had been a bustling hub of America's war effort. Close examination revealed no power cables, no batteries, no modifications of any kind. According to all logic, it should have been as dead and silent as the airfield itself. I reached out tentatively and placed my hand on the cool metal housing. The instant my skin made contact, the rotation stopped abruptly, the beam freezing in place and illuminating a far corner of the hangar. My breath caught in my throat as I saw what appeared to be a shadow against the wall, a human silhouette that vanished the moment I blinked. My heart hammered against my ribs as I called out, asking if anyone was there. My voice echoed back, distorted and somehow wrong, as if the acoustics of the building were designed to transform sounds into something unrecognizable. No one answered, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched from multiple angles. Determined to document everything before my courage failed completely, I began systematically photographing the hangar. Each time the beam passed over me, having resumed its rotation the moment I removed my hand, that same displacement of air occurred, growing stronger with each pass. By the fifth rotation, it was strong enough to ruffle my hair and tug at my clothing, like the downwash from rotors passing just overhead. Time seemed to stretch and contract in that place. What felt like minutes on my watch registered as hours, and the night deepened around the isolated hangar. My mouth went dry, and my hands trembled slightly as I changed photographic plates. I'd come prepared with my traditional equipment rather than digital. Something about capturing these historical spaces felt more authentic with the same technology that would have documented them in their prime. When I developed these plates later, I would discover the true horror of Hangar 14. At some point I noticed that the spotlight's movements had changed. No longer was it making a complete rotation. Instead, it began to focus on specific areas of the hangar for longer periods, as if searching, or showing me something. The beam settled on one section of floor with particularly dense circular markings. As it held there, the air above the spot wavered like heat rising from summer asphalt, though the hangar was bone-chillingly cold. I raised my camera with trembling hands and took several exposures. The displacement of air was now continuous, a persistent downward pressure that made my ears hurt and forced me to widen my stance to maintain balance. The sound came next, not heard with my ears but felt in my bones and teeth, a deep, pulsing thrum that I recognized from hundreds of hours of research recordings. The distinctive engine signature of a B-17 Flying Fortress, but wrong somehow, distorted as if playing at the wrong speed. I backed away, my shoulder blades pressing against the cold metal wall of the hangar. The spotlight swung toward me with sudden, deliberate movement, pinning me in its harsh glare. My eyes watered, and my skin prickled with heat from its unexpected intensity. Through squinted eyes, I noticed dark shapes forming in the beam itself. Silhouettes of what appeared to be men standing in formation, their features indistinct except for the unmistakable outlines of oxygen masks covering the lower portions of their faces. My rational mind fractured along with my composure. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. The caretaker had mentioned something about Hangar 14 being part of a classified testing program in the later years of the war. Experiments with new navigation systems designed to allow bombing runs in zero visibility conditions. He'd mumbled something about accidents and the facility being decommissioned suddenly, the records sealed and forgotten. The beam pivoted away, releasing me from its hold, and I gasped for breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My legs threatened to give way, pins and needles running up and down my calves as if I'd been standing still for hours rather than minutes. The spotlight now moved with purpose, illuminating sections of the hangar in a specific sequence, lingering on each area just long enough for me to feel the presence of something substantial forming in the air above. Swallowing my fear, I forced myself to follow the beam's guidance, taking photographs at each location it illuminated. The camera felt impossibly heavy in my hands, my fingers numb with cold despite the leather gloves I wore. Each click of the shutter seemed to agitate whatever presence filled the hangar. The air displacements grew more violent, and the thrumming engine noise rose in pitch until it bordered on painful. Hours passed this way, a macabre dance between myself, the spotlight, and whatever invisible presence it was revealing. Outside, the sky would be lightening soon, though no windows existed in this particular hangar to confirm it. My watch had stopped at 3:17 a.m., another impossibility to add to the growing list. The final revelation came when the spotlight suddenly powered down, plunging the hangar into absolute darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, panic rising in my throat like bile. Before I could find it, the spotlight blazed back to life at twice its previous intensity, now projecting directly upward to the ceiling of the hangar. What I saw there broke something fundamental in my understanding of reality. The ceiling reflected not the interior of the hangar, but a nighttime aerial view of what I recognized as London during the Blitz. Fires burning across the cityscape, searchlights scanning the sky, and the unmistakable silhouette of a B-17 flying far too low. The perspective was from above the bomber, as if I was witnessing its approach from an impossible vantage point. My legs finally gave way, and I collapsed to my knees, camera clutched protectively against my chest. The air pressure in the hangar dropped catastrophically, my eardrums threatening to rupture. The concrete beneath me trembled, and dust rained down from support beams that had stood motionless for decades. Then everything stopped. The spotlight switched off, this time for good. My flashlight suddenly worked again, its beam pathetically weak after the otherworldly illumination I'd just witnessed. The hangar was just a hangar again, empty, cold, abandoned. I gathered my equipment with shaking hands and fled. 3 days later, I developed the photographic plates in my darkroom. What they revealed has haunted me ever since. Each image showed the same empty hangar, except for the areas where the spotlight had lingered longest. There, captured in silver halide with undeniable clarity, were the silhouettes of airmen, some standing at attention, others seated as if at control stations, all wearing the distinctive oxygen masks of high-altitude bomber crews. Their forms were transparent but unmistakable, and their positioning corresponded exactly to crew stations of a B-17. Most disturbing was the final plate, taken when the spotlight had projected upward. The image showed not the ceiling of the hangar, but the interior of a bomber cockpit, as seen from the navigator's position. Through the windows, fires burned across London. The reflection of the pilot's face was visible in the glass. His oxygen mask pulled halfway off, his expression frozen in a moment of terrible realization. I've spent the months since that night researching classified records of Millerton Air Base. What I found suggests that in the final months of the war, experimental technology was being tested. Attempts to create a navigation system that could somehow remember previous flight paths and replay them with perfect accuracy. The project was abandoned after a test flight never returned, the bomber and its crew vanishing during what was supposed to be a simulated bombing run. The airbase was decommissioned shortly afterward. Hangar 14 was sealed. The records were buried. I don't photograph abandoned airfields anymore. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still feel that displacement of air above me, the weight of something massive passing overhead, trapped in an endless replay of its final moments. And in my dreams, I see those circular markings on the hangar floor, not as landing patterns, but as ripples in reality itself. Points where something had punctured the thin membrane between then and now, between there and here. Points where something is still trying to return home. Story 4. The first time I heard the chains move, I convinced myself it was the wind. The second time, I blamed the settling of the old building. By the third time, as the rusted links swayed in perfect unison while the air remained deathly still, I could no longer deny what my eyes were witnessing. Something walked among the shadows of St. Augustine's quarantine hospice, and it was making its presence known. My name is Dr. Marcus Thorne, maritime historian specializing in quarantine practices of the 19th century Atlantic Passage. When the Historical Maritime Preservation Society offered me the opportunity to catalog artifacts at St. Augustine's, an abandoned quarantine hospice on Fever Island, I jumped at the chance. The hospice had been sealed since 1897, when the practice of isolating potentially infected travelers fell out of favor. According to the Society's records, many of the original furnishings and medical implements remained intact, untouched for over a century. What the Society failed to mention was the tide's peculiar behavior around the island. The brochure described a tidal anomaly that temporarily isolated the hospice each evening, but downplayed its severity. I discovered the truth shortly after my arrival. By 4 p.m., the surrounding lowlands flooded completely, transforming the hospice into an island within an island until the following morning. The locals who transported me by boat seemed anxious to leave, pointing to their watches repeatedly, as if warning me of an unspoken deadline. The hospice itself loomed against the gray October sky like a monument to forgotten suffering. 3 stories of weathered stone and rotting timber, with windows like hollow eyes staring out to sea. Inside, the main floor housed the receiving area, quarantine offices, and staff quarters. The second and third floors contained the isolation rooms, where those suspected of carrying typhoid, cholera, or yellow fever awaited their fate. Most striking were the chains, hundreds of them, hanging from reinforced ceiling mounts throughout the building. These, I knew from my research, had been used to suspend travelers' luggage above the floor, where it would be fumigated with burning sulfur or chlorine. The practice reflected the miasma theory popular at the time, the belief that disease spread through poisonous air rather than germs. Keeping potentially contaminated objects elevated supposedly minimized spread. I spent my first day documenting the ground floor, photographing ledgers showing passenger names and their ultimate dispositions. Released, transferred to hospital, or simply deceased. As daylight began to fade, I set up my temporary workspace in what had once been the head physician's office, the room farthest from the chains that filled the main hall. The first strange occurrence happened at precisely 4:38 p.m., according to my watch. A soft metallic tinkling, like distant wind chimes, drew me into the main hall. There, in the fading light, I saw dozens of chains swaying gently, as if disturbed by a breeze. Yet the air was perfectly still. I approached one chain, examining it closely, finding no source of movement. When I touched it, the cold metal sent a shiver through my hand, and the chain immediately stilled. Seconds later, it resumed its gentle swaying, matching the rhythm of all the others. I retreated to my workspace, attributing the phenomenon to some quirk of air circulation in the old building. Perhaps changes in temperature as evening approached created subtle currents. This explanation satisfied me until 5:17 p.m., when the second incident occurred. This time, the sound was more pronounced, a synchronized clanking that echoed through the building. I returned to the main hall to find the chains swinging more vigorously, tracing identical arcs in the dim light. My scientific mind scrambled for explanations: seismic activity, settlement of the building's foundation, even hallucinations brought on by mold spores. None seemed adequate. I decided to distract myself with work, focusing on a particularly interesting collection of quarantine officers' notes. Within these pages, I discovered the first mention of nocturnal disturbances, reported by staff. The head physician had dismissed these accounts as superstition among the orderlies, attributing their claims to the natural sounds of an isolated building and the psychological strain of working among the sick and dying. At 6:05 p.m., as darkness enveloped the island completely, the third incident shattered any remaining skepticism. The chains throughout the building began to move in perfect unison, swinging in wide, deliberate arcs. The sound was no longer a gentle tinkling, but a thunderous clanking that reverberated through the stone walls. I stood, paralyzed, as my brain processed what my eyes refused to believe. There was intention in this movement, purpose. That's when I heard the footsteps above me. Heavy, deliberate steps crossed the ceiling of the main hall, moving from one end to the other with slow determination. My heart hammered against my ribs, and sweat beaded on my forehead despite the evening chill. I knew from my preliminary inspection that the staircase to the upper floors had collapsed decades ago. Access was impossible without specialized equipment, which I'd planned to bring on a future visit. Yet the footsteps continued, moving directly overhead, stopping occasionally as if their owner was examining something of interest. Then came a new sound, a scraping, dragging noise that followed the footsteps. Something heavy being pulled across the floor. Against my better judgment, I called out, asking if someone else was in the building. My voice sounded small and thin against the rhythmic clanking of chains. No response came except the continued footsteps and dragging. Gathering what courage remained, I approached the ruined staircase. Its steps collapsed into a pile of rotting timber. In the beam of my flashlight, something caught my attention. Fresh marks on the rusted handrail. Bright scratches in the oxidized metal. They appeared at regular intervals, as if something had been dragged up the impossible stairway, leaving behind evidence of its passage. My mouth went dry. My limbs felt leaden. Every instinct screamed for immediate evacuation, but the tide made that impossible until morning. I was trapped with whatever walked the upper floors. I retreated to the physician's office, barricading the door with a heavy desk. Through the small window, I could still see part of the main hall, where the chains continued their synchronized dance. I tried using my satellite phone to call for emergency evacuation, but no signal reached through the thick stone walls. The rational part of my mind continued to search for explanations. Perhaps another researcher had found a different access point to the upper floors. Maybe local teenagers using the abandoned hospice for thrill-seeking. None of these explanations accounted for the impossibility of the moving chains or the marks on a staircase no one could climb. As night deepened, so did the manifestations. The temperature in the building plummeted until my breath clouded before me. The chains began to twist and writhe like living things, some stretching toward the floor as if reaching for something. The footsteps multiplied, no longer one set, but many, moving between rooms upstairs with purpose and direction. I huddled in the corner of the office, flashlight clutched in trembling hands, documenting everything in my voice recorder. If nothing else, there would be a record of what transpired here. I found myself wondering about the quarantine officer whose notes I'd been reading. Had he experienced these same phenomena? Had he too dismissed them until confronted with undeniable evidence? Around midnight, the footsteps changed direction. Instead of moving across the upper floor, they began to descend. My entire body tensed as I heard them reach the landing where the staircase had collapsed. Logic dictated they should stop there, trapped by the missing stairs. They didn't stop. Step by step, they descended the non-existent staircase, accompanied by the sound of chains dragging across the floor. Through a crack in the barricaded door, I watched in horror as the chains in the main hall parted like curtains, creating a path from the staircase to the center of the room. What emerged from the shadows defied description, not because it was incomprehensible, but because there was nothing to see. The footsteps entered the main hall, heavy and deliberate, yet nothing visible made them. The floorboards creaked under significant weight. Dust particles scattered as if disturbed by movement. But there was nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. The chains nearest to this invisible presence began to rise from the floor, lifting as if being gathered by unseen hands. They twisted together, taking shape, forming what appeared to be a crude harness or restraint. As they assembled themselves, I noticed dark stains on the links, old and brown but somehow glistening wet in my flashlight's beam. My academic mind, even in terror, connected the pieces. Quarantine wasn't just for luggage. In the worst outbreaks, when isolation rooms filled beyond capacity, the desperate staff had sometimes restrained the most dangerous patients, those in the throes of delirium or violent fever, using chain harnesses suspended from the ceiling. It kept them from harming themselves or others while maximizing the limited floor space. The historical records never mentioned this practice. It was too brutal, too medieval to acknowledge in official documentation. But here was the evidence, assembling itself before my eyes. A sound filled the hall then, not footsteps or chains, but something between a moan and a wheeze. The labored breathing of someone fighting for air through fluid-filled lungs. It circled the room, stopping at each hanging chain, inspecting them as if searching for something specific. When it approached the office door, I stopped breathing entirely. The handle jiggled. The wood creaked as something pressed against it. My barricade shifted slightly, the heavy desk scraping a few inches across the floor before the pressure ceased. Through the long hours until dawn, the presence roamed the building. Sometimes above, sometimes on my floor. The chains continued their dance, occasionally forming those horrible harness shapes before falling lifeless again. The temperature fluctuated wildly, freezing cold followed by stifling, fever-like heat that left me drenched in sweat. When the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, the phenomena ceased abruptly. The chains hung motionless. The footsteps fell silent. The oppressive presence that had filled the building receded like the tide around the island. I waited until full daylight before removing my barricade. The main hall appeared unchanged, save for one detail. The floor beneath the chains was marked with dozens of wet footprints that hadn't been there the day before. As I watched, they evaporated in the morning light, leaving no trace. The boat returned at 8 a.m. as scheduled. The operator seemed surprised to see me waiting on the dock, bags packed, research incomplete. When he asked if I'd be returning to continue my work, my throat closed around the lie I tried to tell. Instead, I simply shook my head. Before leaving, I took one final photograph of the hospice. When developed later, the image showed St. Augustine's as I'd seen it, except for hundreds of dark figures hanging suspended from chains in every window, their features obscured, but their suffering unmistakable. I've since become obsessed with uncovering the truth about St. Augustine's. My research has led me to sealed medical records and personal journals of former staff. What I've found suggests the official mortality figures were dramatically understated. During a particularly virulent yellow fever outbreak in 1872, the desperate staff implemented extreme measures for the overwhelming number of patients. Those deemed beyond saving were moved to the upper floors, restrained to prevent self-harm during fever delirium, and essentially left to die to conserve resources for those with better chances. I petitioned the Historical Maritime Preservation Society to permanently seal St. Augustine's, citing structural concerns. My true motivation remains private. Some things should remain quarantined, some sufferings acknowledged but not disturbed. But in my darkest moments when sleep eludes me, I hear again the synchronized movement of chains and wonder. Are they reaching out for help, for acknowledgement, or for company? And I wonder what might happen if I return to that island, not as a researcher, but as a witness to a suffering that refuses to end. Sometimes, I think I already know the answer. The chains I photographed have begun to sway in the pictures, just slightly, just enough to notice if you look closely. And last night I dreamed of climbing an impossible staircase, dragging something heavy behind me. Story 5. The old rock shelter felt different tonight. I'd spent countless evenings monitoring seismic activity in this remote corner of Black Ridge National Park, but something in the air had changed. Maybe it was the unusual barometric pressure drop, or the way the wind whispered through the ancient igneous formations outside, less a sound than a vibration against my skin. As I set up my equipment in the dim light of my LED headlamp, the shadows seemed to linger a beat too long when I turned away. My name is Daniel Reeves, volunteer geologist with the USGS. For the past 6 months, I'd been cataloging minor tremors in this area, mostly 16ths on the Richter scale. Vibrations so subtle, only our sensitive equipment could detect them. The Park Service had granted me use of this natural rock shelter, a shallow cave reinforced with stone walls erected by the CCC back in the 1930s. I'd grown fond of the solitude, the quiet communion with stone and earth. The storage closet at the back of the shelter was where the park rangers kept emergency supplies and maintenance equipment. I needed fresh batteries for my seismograph, and as I rummaged through the dusty shelves, my fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. Not plastic or metal, but glass. Oddly textured glass that seemed to absorb the light from my headlamp rather than reflect it. I pulled it out, a lantern, unlike any I'd ever seen. Its body was crafted from what appeared to be obsidian, but not the glossy volcanic glass I was familiar with. This was different, matte black, with a strange porosity that made it look almost organic. A small brass plate on its base read, "Forged from the sands of Mount Pelham, 1897. I knew Mount Pelham well. It was the dominant volcanic peak in this range, dormant for centuries but still geologically significant. Curiosity got the better of me. The lantern had a simple oil chamber and wick arrangement, and to my surprise, it was still filled with fuel. The brass ignition switch felt warm under my thumb, almost body temperature, despite the chill of the storage room. I flicked it. The wick caught immediately, but the flame wasn't right. It burned a deep amber color, steady and without flicker, as if frozen in time. When I held it up, the beam it cast was like no light I'd ever seen. It created a perfect circle of amber illumination, but within that circle, the rocks and tools of the shelter simply vanished. Not illuminated, not even cast into deeper shadow, but rendered into a peculiar absence. I swept the lantern across the far wall. The stones disappeared within its light, replaced by what I can only describe as negative space, the inverse of shadow. And within that negative space, I saw them for the first time. Silhouettes, warped and semi-melted, writhing against a brightness that shouldn't exist in the darkness of the shelter. They moved like people underwater, their forms stretching and contracting with slow, deliberate movements. My heart slammed against my ribcage, the first surge of adrenaline flooding my system. Sweat broke out across my forehead despite the cool air. I moved the lantern away, and the wall returned to normal, just rough-hewn stone, unremarkable and solid. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, a trick of light and exhaustion after too many solitary nights. I returned to my work, setting up the night's monitoring equipment, but the lantern sat on the table beside me, its amber glow creating that perfect circle on the ceiling. Throughout the evening, I caught glimpses of movement within that circle, brief contortions of form and substance that vanished when I looked directly at them. The seismograph remained quiet, too quiet. Usually there would be tiny spikes throughout the night, the Earth's subtle adjustments, but the needle remained dead still. The silence of the instrumentation unsettled me more than any reading would have. 3 hours into my shift, a sudden, irrational impulse took hold. I grabbed the lantern and directed its amber beam at my own feet. The stone floor disappeared beneath me, replaced by that negative space, but now I could feel the difference physically. The temperature plummeted. My breath clouded the air. The ground beneath my boots felt different, no longer the solid rock of the shelter, but something yielding and damp, as if I stood on soil instead of stone. A low vibration began to build, too deep to hear but felt in my bones and teeth. The seismograph's needle jumped violently, then settled into a slow, rhythmic pattern, like a heartbeat. 5 seconds later, another tremor, stronger this time. My equipment registered it as coming from directly below me, hundreds of feet below, which was impossible. The geological surveys showed solid bedrock extending down at least 2 miles beneath the shelter. I stumbled backward, dropping the lantern. It didn't break but rolled across the floor, its beam sweeping across the walls. Everywhere the light touched, the stone dissolved into that negative space, and the silhouettes appeared. More of them now, dozens, their forms more distinct. They weren't random shapes. They were humanoid but wrong, elongated in places, compressed in others, as if viewed through a lens that distorted space itself. My mouth went desert dry. I couldn't swallow. The tremors continued, now in perfect sync with my own racing pulse. This wasn't coincidence. Something was responding to me, to my fear, to my presence. I forced myself to approach the lantern again. Scientific curiosity warred with primal terror. With shaking hands, I picked it up, examining it more carefully in the blue-white glow of my electric lamps. The glass wasn't just black. It contained what looked like tiny amber inclusions, thousands of them, moving within the material itself, like insects trapped in honey. The park ranger who'd shown me the shelter had mentioned rumors about this place. Old stories I'd dismissed as local color. He'd said the shelter had been built over the entrance to an older, deeper cave system that had been sealed up in the early 1900s after several disappearances. The official records claimed the disappearances were due to unmarked sinkholes and treacherous terrain, but local legends spoke of thin places where the boundary between our world and somewhere else weakened. I'd laughed then. I wasn't laughing now. With deliberate scientific precision, I began testing the lantern's properties. When I shone it on inanimate objects, my backpack, the monitoring equipment, the walls, they disappeared in the amber light, replaced by that negative space. But living things reacted differently. When the beam caught a spider crawling across the ceiling, the arachnid didn't vanish. Instead, it cast a shadow much larger than its actual size, a shadow that moved independently of the spider itself. My hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the lantern steady. My throat constricted, making each breath a conscious effort. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. Hallucinations from carbon monoxide, a gas leak, exhaustion-induced psychosis. But none of these explained the seismograph's readings, which continued their impossible pattern. I tried calling out on my satellite phone. No signal, though I'd had perfect reception earlier that evening. I was alone with whatever this was. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I decided to conduct one final experiment. I stood before the small mirror I kept for grooming, held the lantern at arm's length, and directed its beam at my reflection. What happened next defies rational explanation. My reflection vanished, replaced by a figure that was both me and not me. It had my general dimensions but lacked distinct features. And behind it, behind me, stretched a vast, cavernous space that couldn't possibly exist within the confines of the shelter. The narrow chamber I stood in seemed to open into an enormous underground cathedral, with stalactites hanging from heights lost in darkness, and massive columns of stone rising from an unseen floor. The ground shook violently. The temperature dropped so sharply that frost formed on my equipment. My ears popped with a sudden pressure change, as if I'd descended thousands of feet in seconds. And the figure in the mirror, the not me, lifted what should have been its arm and pointed to a spot behind my left shoulder. I whirled around, still holding the lantern, its beam now illuminating the back wall of the shelter. The stone was gone, replaced by a passage that couldn't exist. Beyond it, those silhouettes gathered, Dozens of them, their forms now unmistakably watching me. They made no move to approach, but their attention was palpable, a weight pressing against my consciousness. One detached from the group and drifted closer to the threshold between their space and mine. Its form was more defined than the others, a suggestion of head and shoulders, limbs that were almost human but jointed wrong, elongated beyond natural proportions. It extended what might have been a hand, beckoning. My body responded before my mind could process what was happening. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet, sending equipment crashing to the floor. The lantern flew from my grasp, landing on its side, the beam now pointing at the ceiling. A heartbeat of silence followed. Then the earth convulsed. It wasn't like any earthquake I'd experienced. The ground didn't simply shake. It pulsed, contracted, as if the stone itself were breathing. The walls of the shelter buckled inward, not cracking but warping, the solid rock behaving like fabric in a wind. The seismograph went wild for 3 seconds, then died as the power generator failed. I lunged for the lantern, driven by the irrational certainty that I needed to turn it off, to break the connection it had established. As my fingers closed around its cold glass body, another tremor knocked me to my knees. The brass plate caught my eye again. Forged from the sands of Mount Pelham, 1897. But now additional text had appeared beneath it, as if etched by invisible hands. The glass remembers what it once was, and what lies beneath. With trembling fingers, I twisted the valve, cutting off the fuel supply. The amber flame guttered and died. The effect was immediate. The temperature normalized. The tremor subsided. The walls solidified back into ordinary stone. In the sudden darkness, I fumbled for my flashlight, breathing heavily, my shirt soaked with cold sweat. When I finally got the light on, the shelter was exactly as it should be. No passages, no negative space, no silhouettes. Just rock and equipment and the quiet of the mountain night. The lantern in my hands looked different too. Older, more weathered, the glass now cloudy and cracked in places. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the entrance, watching the lantern, afraid to sleep, yet too exhausted to leave. When dawn finally broke, I packed my essentials and the lantern, which I wrapped carefully in my spare clothes. The park rangers would be changing shifts soon. They'd think I was crazy if I told them what happened, so I decided to say nothing, at least until I could examine the lantern under controlled conditions. As I walked down the trail toward the ranger station, a massive tremor shook the mountainside, the first seismic event large enough to be felt without instruments in over 50 years, according to later reports. Trees swayed, rocks tumbled down slopes. I dropped to the ground, covering my head. When the shaking stopped, I looked back toward the shelter. A cloud of dust rose from its location, and even from a distance, I could see that part of the structure had collapsed. Where my monitoring equipment had been stationed, a dark opening now gaped in the earth, a passage revealed by the tremor, leading down into darkness. From my backpack, muffled by layers of clothing, came a faint amber glow. The lantern had reignited itself. I'm writing this from a motel 30 miles from the park. I've sealed the lantern in a lockbox designed for transporting geological samples. Tomorrow I'll take it to the university for analysis, though part of me knows no scientific instrument will explain what I experienced. The glass remembers, the inscription said. I think I'm beginning to understand what that means. Sometimes, when everything is quiet, I feel the floor beneath me shift, just slightly, as if adjusting to a weight far below. And in those moments, I swear I can see, from the corner of my eye, a tall figure with 2 long limbs, watching from just outside my peripheral vision, beckoning with long, distorted fingers. The lockbox sits in the bathtub, wrapped in towels. Even through its secure walls, I can see a faint amber glow seeping through the cracks, growing stronger with each passing hour. Story 6. The moment I stepped into the abandoned textile mill, my calibrated instruments failed me. Digital gauges flickered, then died. Analog needles swung in erratic half-circles before settling on impossible readings. 23 years as an industrial electrician had taught me to trust my equipment, but as I stared at the massive steam boiler rising like a metal monolith from the factory floor, something primitive inside me whispered that this job would defy all technical knowledge. The air hung thick with decades of dormant energy, not electrical current, but something more fundamental and unnerving. My footsteps echoed through the cavernous space as I approached the control panel, my breath forming small clouds in the unnaturally cold air. Rickman Textiles hadn't produced a single yard of fabric since 1977, nearly 50 years of silence, yet the building felt expectant, as if it had been waiting specifically for me. The job seemed straightforward when the property developer called. Recommission the main boiler system to prove the facility's infrastructure remained viable for conversion into luxury apartments. Simple diagnostics, basic rewiring, and controlled power restoration. 6 hours of work at most. Now, standing before the massive industrial heart of the building, I wondered why the previous 3 contractors had abandoned the job without explanation. The boiler room stretched before me like the interior of a mechanical cathedral. Copper pipes branched upward in complex arrays, disappearing into shadowed ceiling spaces. The main unit itself was a behemoth of 1950s industrial engineering, 15 feet tall and twice as wide, with pressure gauges larger than dinner plates. A marvel of its time, all rivets and welded seams, built when American manufacturing stood unchallenged. The air smelled wrong. Not the expected mustiness of abandonment, but something sharper, chemical. Almost like burned cotton, though no production had occurred here in half a century. I flipped open my toolbox and retrieved my voltage meter, pressing the leads against the main junction box. Dead, as expected. The facility had been disconnected from the grid for decades. My first task was restoring the 3-phase power supply. I worked methodically, cleaning corroded connections, replacing degraded insulation, and calibrating the distribution panel. 4 hours of concentration with only the occasional creaks of the building for company. When the final connection snapped into place, I paused before throwing the master switch, experiencing an inexplicable reluctance. Something about the building's perfect stillness felt like a held breath. I shook off the sensation. This was electrical work, not ghost hunting. The heavy switch required both hands and significant effort to engage. The system hummed to life with a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate not just through the air but through the concrete beneath my boots. The overhead lights flickered reluctantly, casting the space in a sickly yellow glow that somehow made the shadows deeper rather than banishing them. Then I heard it. The whistle, high-pitched and distant at first, like a train miles away, but distinctly coming from within the boiler system itself. The sound traveled through the dormant pipes, a single note that wavered slightly before stabilizing. No steam system should make such a noise without pressure. I checked the gauges, all still at 0. The sound continued, thin and persistent, almost musical in its consistency. I tracked the noise to a section of piping I'd just re-welded. The steel was ice-cold to the touch, yet beaded with moisture that shouldn't have been physically possible without a temperature differential. As I wiped my hand across the condensation, my fingertips arranged the droplets into patterns that refused to drip randomly. They formed precise rows, like notes on a staff. 5 perfect lines of water droplets marched across the metal surface, with larger beads positioned exactly where musical notation would place them. I blinked hard and looked again. The pattern remained, impossible and deliberate. When I touched the fresh weld I'd created, a sensation like electric current surged through my arm. Not painful, but deeply unsettling. It felt as if warm air was flowing inside my bones, following the paths of marrow. My skin prickled with goose flesh, hair standing upright from wrist to shoulder. The distant whistling intensified, joined by a mechanical click-click-click from deeper in the facility. I followed the sound through a doorway marked turbine room, flashlight beam cutting through thick shadows. The massive generators stood in a row, each the size of a small car, their copper windings dull with age. What I saw defied explanation. The nearest turbine's blades were turning. Slowly, perhaps 1 revolution per minute, but unmistakably in motion without power or steam to drive them. I checked the connection points, completely disconnected. The emergency cutoffs were all engaged. No power source existed, yet the machine turned with quiet determination, pushed by invisible force. I approached cautiously, playing my flashlight across the spinning metal. A vapor rose from the housing, not steam, which would be visible as white clouds in the cold air, but something different, colorless yet somehow perceptible. It carried that same burned cotton scent that had greeted me upon arrival, only stronger now. When the vapor touched my skin, it left no moisture, but triggered that same internal warmth, as if my blood was being gently heated. The property developer had mentioned nothing unusual about the facility's history, just another victim of globalization when textile production shifted overseas. The building had stood empty since its closure, visited only by security patrols and the occasional urban explorer. Now I found myself wondering what had really happened here in 1977. What final production run had occurred before the doors closed permanently? I retreated to the boiler room, unable to explain the turning turbine but determined to complete my contracted work. The whistling had stopped, replaced by a low, almost subsonic vibration. I could feel it in my teeth more than hear it. My digital camera refused to function, screen displaying only static. Cell phone signal showed no bars. Even my battery-powered tools seemed weaker, diminished. The boiler itself needed inspection before I could certify it operational. I unlatched the main access panel, swinging open the heavy door to reveal the fire chamber inside. My flashlight beam caught something unexpected. The interior walls were covered in markings, not the expected carbon buildup from coal combustion, but deliberate patterns etched into the metal. Flowing script in no language I recognized curved along every surface, interrupted occasionally by geometric symbols that seemed to pulsate subtly in my light beam. I reached out without thinking, tracing one symbol with my fingertip. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. My consciousness seemed to split, part of me still standing before the open boiler, another part suddenly aware of the entire building as if it were an extension of my nervous system. I could feel every pipe, every valve, every chamber, miles of connectivity spreading through the structure like veins and arteries in a body. And within that system, something circulated that was neither water nor steam, something alive. My hand jerked back, breaking contact. Cold sweat drenched my shirt despite the frigid air. The room tilted around me, perspective shifting in nauseating waves. I stumbled backward, desperate to put distance between myself and the boiler. My elbow struck a valve wheel, spinning it partially open with a metallic squeal. The effect was instantaneous. The whistle returned, no longer distant but directly overhead, a piercing tone that drove ice picks into my eardrums. The overhead pipes shuddered violently, expanding and contracting as if breathing. More moisture appeared on every metal surface, forming those same musical patterns across walls and equipment. The sheet metal walls of the boiler itself began to flex outward and inward, the rhythm matching precisely to the beating of my terrified heart. I had to shut down the power. Whatever connection I'd established had triggered something within the dormant systems, something that had been waiting decades for reactivation. I scrambled toward the main distribution panel, vision tunneling with panic. The floor beneath me grew slick with impossible condensation, causing my boots to slide with each step. The moisture formed more patterns, not random puddles, but precise shapes reminiscent of circuit diagrams and flowcharts. The whistle modulated, forming distinct tones that cycled through what I recognized as musical scales. The sound penetrated my skull, seeming to resonate with specific thoughts. Images flooded my mind. Rows of workers at massive looms, their movements synchronized to the machine's rhythms. Fabric flowing endlessly through mechanical jaws, steam hissing through copper arteries. But something was wrong about these visions. The workers' faces blurred and indistinct, their movements too fluid, too perfect. Their arms connected directly to the machines, flesh and metal joined in seamless interface. I reached the power panel and grasped the main breaker with slippery fingers. The metal burned cold against my skin, frost forming instantly around my fingertips. I pulled with all my strength, but the switch refused to move, not jammed or frozen, but actively resisting, as if held in place by invisible force. The whistling changed to words. Not English, not any human language, but somehow I understood. The textile mill was sharing its history, its purpose. This had never been a simple manufacturing facility. The fabric produced here had been merely a byproduct, a cover for something else entirely. The true product had been the patterns, mathematical sequences embedded in textile designs, distributed worldwide in ordinary-seeming fabrics. Curtains, bedsheets, clothing, all carrying embedded information, frequencies that resonated with human nervous systems in subtle, cumulative ways. I finally wrenched the power switch downward. The lights died instantly, plunging me into darkness broken only by my faltering flashlight. But the whistling continued, the turbine still turned, the moisture still formed its deliberate patterns across every surface. The power had never been the true source. The electrical system had merely been a key, unlocking something that now sustained itself through other means. The air around me grew thick, resistant to movement. Each breath required conscious effort, as if I were inhaling light syrup. My flashlight caught movement at the edges of my vision, the flat surfaces of gauge panels and metal housings rippling like disturbed water. Reflections in these surfaces showed impossible things. A factory floor fully operational, staffed by figures that were neither fully human nor machine, biological components meshed seamlessly with mechanical systems. The metal floor beneath me softened, my boots sinking slightly with each step as I backed toward the exit. The entire room seemed to be losing structural integrity, solid surfaces becoming malleable. Pipes bent at impossible angles, tracking my movement like curious snakes. The burned cotton smell intensified, joined by chemical odors I recognized from my electrical work: ozone, hot copper, phenolic resin. I reached the main doorway, fumbling for the handle only to find it had transformed. No longer metal, it felt organic under my fingers, warm and slightly yielding. I yanked my hand back and threw my shoulder against the door itself, which now gave way like thick membrane rather than steel. I tumbled through into the hallway beyond. The corridor stretched before me, illuminated by my wildly swinging flashlight beam. The exit sign glowed faintly at the far end, still powered by its emergency battery. I ran, feet slipping on floor surfaces that alternated between impossibly smooth and tacky with residue. Behind me, the whistling rose to a scream, harmonics layering into complex chords that seemed to hook into my spine and pull backward. I focused entirely on the exit sign, ignoring the sensations of being watched from every angle. The walls around me had developed textures reminiscent of fabric weaves, patterns shifting and flowing like time-lapse photography of growing plants. My flashlight beam passed through certain sections of air that appeared thicker, more substantial, leaving momentary tunnels of clarity that collapsed behind me. The exit door appeared normal, standard industrial fire door with panic bar. I slammed against it with desperate force, the bar giving way with a solid mechanical click that felt reassuringly mundane. Cool night air rushed in, shockingly ordinary after the miasma inside. I stumbled into the parking lot, gasping in deep lungfuls of clean atmosphere. I turned back to face the building, half expecting to see it transformed into some Lovecraftian architectural nightmare. Instead, it stood as it had upon my arrival, imposing but conventional industrial architecture, dark windows reflecting the security lights of the parking area. Only the slightest movement behind one second-floor window suggested anything unusual, a rhythmic pulsing like slow breathing. My van stood where I'd parked it, keys still in my pocket. I backed toward it, unwilling to turn my back on the building. Through one ground-floor window, I could see the control panel I'd restored to functionality. The indicator lights flickered in precise patterns that reminded me of binary code or Morse signals. A message being transmitted, or perhaps a beacon activated. Back in my vehicle, I sat trembling, key in the ignition but unturned. Professional responsibility warred with primal fear. My contract required me to secure the site before leaving. Power disconnected, access panels closed, tools retrieved. My equipment remained scattered throughout the boiler room, Documentation unfinished. The client would expect my report tomorrow. Recommendations for further restoration or condemnation. The building watched me through dark windows. Patient. It had waited almost 50 years for reactivation. It could wait a few more hours for my return. The partial connectivity I'd established wasn't going anywhere. If anything, it was growing stronger. I could feel it even at this distance. A subtle pressure behind my eyes, musical notation dancing at the edges of my vision. I turned the key and pulled away, tires crunching on gravel. In my rearview mirror, soft light bloomed in the factory windows, one by one, though I'd cut all power. The whistling had stopped, but in the silence of my van, I could hear something else, a soft, rhythmic clicking coming from my own chest, perfectly synchronized with my heartbeat. Tomorrow, I would call the client. I would explain that the facility required specialized equipment I didn't possess. I would recommend experts in industrial archaeology, perhaps hazardous materials remediation. I would not return alone. And tonight, I would burn the work shirt I'd worn inside, destroy the boots that had walked those floors. But even as I formed these plans, I felt the patterns spreading through my mind, beautiful, elegant sequences that promised understanding beyond human limits. Part of me was already composing reasons to return. After all, I'd left my best tools behind, and there was still so much to learn about what really happened at Rickman Textiles in 1977 and what had finally awakened in 2025. The patterns demanded completion. The machinery needed maintenance. The factory required workers. And somewhere deep inside me, embedded in bone and tissue, a faint whistling had begun. Story 7. The digital readout blinks red in the darkness. 7B. Again. The same elevator, the same time, 3:17 a.m. My breath catches as goosebumps ripple across my skin. Maintenance sealed off 7B 3 weeks ago after reports of mechanical failures, yet it calls to me night after night from a place that doesn't exist. My supervisor insists there is no sub-level 3. The blueprints confirm it. The building's foundation ends at sub-level 2. Yet, here I am, watching the call button pulse like a wounded heart in the control room's half-light, beckoning me down to the impossible. My job is simple. Overnight elevator operator at Thornfield Towers, a luxury residential complex stretching 40 floors into the city skyline. Most nights pass in drowsy monotony, escorting late-night revelers to their penthouses, helping insomniacs transport their garbage, occasionally moving furniture for those who can't sleep and decide 2 a.m. is the perfect time to redecorate. The position is a relic, an architectural quirk preserved from the building's original 1930s design, though they've modernized everything else. The residents find comfort in tradition, or so management claims. I find comfort in the solitude, in the measured predictability of ascent and descent, until 3 weeks ago. The first phantom call came after a thunderstorm knocked out power to half the block. Emergency generators hummed to life, bathing the lobby in sickly yellow light. I was performing standard post-outage checks when the operator panel lit up. 7B, sub-level 3. My stomach dropped. Thornfield has 6 elevator banks, A through F, each with 2 cars, numbered 1 and 2. There is no 7B, and there is certainly no sub-level 3. I dismissed it as an electrical glitch, a surge-induced error in the ancient monitoring system. But the call persisted, a stubborn red eye in the darkness. Following protocol for unexplained signals, I entered the override code and sent elevator 6B down to sub-level 2, the lowest floor. The call light should have extinguished. It didn't. My supervisor, Miles, had left early that night, driven away by migraines that always seemed to arrive with bad weather. The building stood empty except for sleeping residents and myself. I could have ignored the call, logged it as an electrical anomaly, and continued my rounds. But curiosity, that primordial human failing, pushed me toward the service stairwell. The staircase to the sublevel smelled of damp concrete and industrial cleaner. My footsteps echoed hollowly as I descended past sublevel 1, the parking garage, into the dimmer regions of sublevel 2, which housed maintenance equipment and the building's massive HVAC system. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying a metallic tang that coated my tongue. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy fire door marked SL2 stood partially ajar, unusual as it should have been secured. Beyond lay the corridor that accessed the elevator shafts, a utilitarian concrete passage lined with numbered maintenance hatches. I made my way to where shafts 7A and 7B should have been, if they existed. Instead, I found a blank wall. Of course, just as the blueprints indicated. I chuckled nervously at my own foolishness, my voice swallowed by the subterranean silence. But as I turned to leave, the wall before me shuddered. A seam appeared where none had been before, splitting the concrete like a wound. The familiar chime of an arriving elevator sliced through the stillness. My heart hammered against my ribs as the seam widened, revealing polished metal doors emblazoned with the number 7B. The rational part of my brain screamed warnings. Buildings don't spontaneously generate elevators. Walls don't simply open. Yet I stood transfixed as the doors parted with a soft pneumatic sigh. Inside waited a perfectly ordinary elevator car. The same walnut paneling, the same brushed steel fixtures, the same mirror on the rear wall that adorned every elevator in Thornfield Towers, except for the control panel, which displayed buttons for 40 above-ground floors, 2 sublevels, and a third button marked SL3. My finger hovered over the sub-level 3 button, trembling slightly. I could still walk away, report a hallucination induced by sleep deprivation, request time off. Instead, I stepped inside and pressed the button. The descent felt longer than it should have. The digital floor indicator moved from SL2 to a blank display, while my stomach lurched with unexpected acceleration. The temperature dropped precipitously. My breath billowed in pale clouds as the elevator hummed downward. A grinding noise emanated from the shaft, metal against metal, a sound like ancient gears reluctantly turning after decades of disuse. When the elevator finally stopped, the jolt nearly brought me to my knees. The doors opened with excruciating slowness, revealing the corridor, exactly as it would appear in my nightmares for weeks to come. White ceramic tiles stretched into darkness, their glossy surfaces reflecting pools of stagnant water. The puddles mirrored lights that weren't there. The ceiling above remained in shadow. No fluorescent fixtures visible, yet the water shimmered with blue-white illumination, rippling occasionally, though the air remained perfectly still. Mounted on the ceiling, a large digital display flashed red numerals, 247, then 246, a countdown. To what? I couldn't imagine. I remained in the elevator, my body refusing to cross the threshold. The countdown continued, 245, 244. My watch read 3:24 a.m., its seconds ticking forward while the ceiling timer marched backward. The air from the corridor carried the scent of chlorine and something else, a metallic, rusty odor reminiscent of old blood. At 07, I noticed movement at the corridor's end, a shadow elongating, stretching toward me. At 05, I heard what might have been footsteps, muffled as if underwater. At 03, the elevator doors began to close. At 00, just as the doors sealed shut, I glimpsed what appeared to be a hand reaching from the darkness, a hand in a sodden, stained white glove. The ascent seemed to take seconds rather than minutes. When the doors opened again, I stood once more in the familiar lobby of Thornfield Towers. My pulse raced as I stumbled out, checking my surroundings frantically. Everything appeared normal. Marble floors gleaming under recessed lighting, leather sofas arranged in conversational groupings, the night security guard dozing at his station. But my reflection in the mirrored elevator doors stopped me cold. I wore not my standard black uniform but an older style, a maroon jacket with gold braid and tarnished buttons, the Thornfield logo from the 1960s emblazoned on the breast pocket. The fabric appeared wet, plastered to my body, and covered in rust-colored stains. I raised my hand to touch my face. In the reflection, the sleeve pulled back to reveal skin mottled with the same rusty patina. But when I looked down at my actual arm, I saw only my normal uniform, dry and clean. The elevator doors closed behind me, and when they did, my reflection normalized. I stood staring at the ordinary me, my mind scrambling for rational explanations. Exhaustion, stress. Perhaps someone had slipped something into my coffee during my dinner break. I nearly convinced myself it had been a bizarre waking dream, until the call came again the next night. Over the weeks that followed, the pattern repeated with subtle variations. The phantom call always came at 3:17 a.m. The countdown timer always displayed different starting times, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, once a full day. The corridor always extended into darkness, the puddles always reflecting non-existent lights. And each time, the doors would begin closing just as the countdown reached 0, just as something approached from the corridor's end. Sometimes I heard whispers from the darkness, words just below the threshold of comprehension. Sometimes the water rippled with movement, as if something swam beneath its surface. Once, I noticed small items floating in the puddles, a key, a wallet, a wristwatch identical to mine. Another time, the corridor appeared dry, but the white tiles had been replaced with mirrors, reflecting infinite versions of myself stretching into darkness. My reflection upon returning to the lobby changed too. Sometimes I appeared decades older, my hair gray, my face lined with wrinkles that disappeared when I touched my actual skin. Sometimes I wore different historical versions of the Thornfield uniform, the double-breasted coat from the 1940s, the polyester abomination from the 1970s. Always the uniforms bore stains. Always they appeared soaked. Always they were covered in that rust-like substance that looked disturbingly like oxidized blood. I began researching the building's history during daylight hours. Thornfield Towers was constructed in 1928, originally as a luxury hotel before being converted to residences in the 1980s. The original plans called for 3 sub-levels, but newspaper archives revealed that during construction, workers broke through into underground water channels that flooded the lowest level. After 3 workers were hospitalized with mysterious illnesses attributed to contaminants in the water, the developers sealed off the 3rd sub-level and redesigned the foundation. More disturbing were the elevator accidents. In 1952, an elevator car plummeted from the 30th floor, killing. No, I reminded myself. No deaths, severely injuring the operator. In 1967, another operator was found unconscious in a service corridor, clothes soaked, babbling about reflections that moved independently, and a timer counting down to something he refused to name. In 1984, during renovation, workers breached a sealed wall in sublevel 2 and reported finding an abandoned elevator shaft leading further down. The opening was promptly resealed, the incident buried in bureaucratic paperwork. My supervisor dismissed my inquiries. There was no sublevel 3, no elevator 7B. The call logs showed no activity during the times I claimed to have descended. The security cameras showed me standing motionless in the control room at precisely the moments I believed I was exploring the phantom corridor. When I insisted, he suggested I see a doctor. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. So could carbon monoxide, which might explain why no one else experienced what I did during their shifts. I almost believed him until I noticed the rust-colored stains on his collar, identical to those on my phantom reflections. Last night I broke protocol. When the call came at 3:17 a.m., I brought equipment, a digital camera, a flashlight, chalk to mark my path. The descent felt familiar now, almost routine, though my heart still raced with each floor the elevator passed. The countdown timer began at 4:19 when the doors opened onto the white-tiled corridor. I stepped out. The floor felt solid beneath my feet, the tiles cold and slightly slick. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the corridor extending perhaps 50 feet before terminating at a metal door. The puddles reflected my light now rather than non-existent fluorescence, rippling as my footsteps disturbed the shallow water. The smell remained, chlorine and rust, and something organic beneath it all. The camera refused to work, its screen displaying only static. The countdown continued, 3:45, 3:44. I marked the tiles with chalk arrows as I advanced, documenting my path, though there were no branching corridors, no rooms leading off, only the straight path to the door. At 1:37, I reached it. A standard maintenance door, unremarkable except for the symbol stenciled at eye level. the ancient elevator logo of Thornfield Towers, not used since the 1930s. The handle turned easily under my grip. The countdown read 102 as I pushed the door open. Beyond lay not another room but an elevator, identical to the one I had left behind, down to the wood paneling and mirrored rear wall. In the reflection stood not myself but a line of men in successive Thornfield uniforms, operators who had come before me, their clothes stained and dripping, their eyes hollow with recognition. The countdown hit 010. The men in the mirror beckoned, their movements synchronized like a single entity with many bodies. 0005. The elevator car called to me with a familiar pneumatic sigh. 0003. Behind me I heard what might have been footsteps, muffled as if underwater. 00. I stepped inside as both sets of doors closed in unison. The elevator ascended. When it opened, I stood once more in the Thornfield lobby. A quick glance at my reflection showed my normal uniform, dry and clean. My digital camera contained no images, its memory card formatted as if never used. The chalk remained in my pocket, unused. Only one thing had changed. The service log in the control room now listed an elevator 7B, scheduled for maintenance after reports of mechanical failures. According to the log, it had been sealed off 3 weeks ago. By me. Tonight at 3:17 a.m., the call will come again. The digital readout will blink red in the darkness. 7B. And this time, I think I'll understand what waits behind the door at the corridor's end. This time, when the countdown reaches 0, I'll finally learn what happens if I stay. Story 8. The coldest fear isn't the one that makes you run. It's the one that paralyzes you completely. I learned this truth while driving through the Black Ridge Tunnel on a Sunday night in October. What happened in those 7 seconds of darkness changed everything I thought I knew about reality. Some nights, I still wake up tasting the acrid scent of damp coal in the back of my throat, my ears ringing with the mechanical clicking of Morse code that shouldn't have known my route. I've been hauling freight across the Continental Divide for 15 years. Veterans like me know all the shortcuts, the spots where state troopers hide, and which tunnels to avoid during tourist season. Black Ridge was my secret weapon, a 4-mile mountain passage that cut nearly an hour off my Denver to Salt Lake run. Most drivers avoided it because of its reputation: narrow lanes, poor lighting, and cell reception that died the moment you entered. But time is money in this business, and I'd traversed it hundreds of times without incident. Until that Sunday. The schedule was tight. I had to deliver a shipment of industrial equipment by 6 a.m. Monday, which meant driving through the night. The autumn air had turned bitter as I approached the eastern entrance of Black Ridge around 2:30 a.m. The mountain loomed above, a massive shadow against the star-scattered sky. A digital sign flashed the tunnel's temperature, 42 degree hours, and warned of possible fog inside. Nothing unusual. The first mile was routine. My high beams cut through the dull orange glow of the overhead lights, illuminating the curved concrete walls. 3 other vehicles shared the tunnel with me: a sedan about a quarter-mile ahead, a pickup truck even further up, and something large, probably another semi, that I could only make out as distant taillights near the western exit. At the 1.8-mile marker, I noticed the first oddity. My radio, which had been silent since I entered the mountain, suddenly crackled to life. I expected the usual static, but instead, I heard a rhythmic series of beeps and pauses. My grandfather had been a Navy radio man, and I recognized Morse code when I heard it. I couldn't translate the message, but something about the mechanical precision of the sounds made my skin crawl. I tried changing stations. Nothing but the same pulsing code on every frequency. The temperature gauge on my dashboard dropped rapidly. 42 degree or 38 degree or 29 degree or within seconds. My breath began to fog in the cabin. The sudden cold penetrated my jacket, causing involuntary shivers to race down my spine. This wasn't normal mountain tunnel climate behavior. Something was happening to the air inside Blackridge. Then came the smell. Anyone who's worked in mining country knows the distinct odor of wet coal, earthy, sulfuric, with an underlying metallic quality that coats your tongue. But coal hasn't been mined in these mountains for decades. The scent grew stronger with each passing second, so intense I could almost taste the mineral grit between my teeth. At exactly the 2.3-mile marker, every light in the tunnel extinguished simultaneously. My headlights, the overhead fixtures, the taillights of the vehicles ahead, even the illuminated dials on my dashboard, all gone in an instant. I've experienced power outages in tunnels before, but never one that affected the vehicles themselves. My truck's engine continued to rumble beneath me, but in a darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. 1. I counted the seconds, gripping the wheel and trying to maintain my lane purely by feel. My heart hammered against my ribs as adrenaline flooded my system. 2. The scraping sound began, like massive claws dragging across asphalt, moving parallel to my truck. Not behind or ahead, but directly beside me where the concrete wall should have been. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like footsteps if each foot were the size of a car. 3. The coal smell intensified until it burned my nostrils. Beneath it emerged something else, the unmistakable stench of decay, the kind that makes your stomach tighten and your throat close involuntarily. 4. The temperature plummeted further. The cold became a physical presence pressing against my skin, seeping into my bones. My teeth chattered uncontrollably as sweat froze on my forehead. 5. The Morse code from the radio grew louder, somehow continuing despite the electrical blackout. The mechanical clicking accelerated, becoming frantic, urgent. 6. Something massive shifted beside my truck. Though I couldn't see it, I felt its presence, a displacement of air, a pressure change that made my ears pop painfully. Whatever moved in the darkness stood taller than my 18-wheeler's cabin. 7. With the same suddenness that they had failed, all lights returned. The abrupt transition from absolute darkness to illumination sent shooting pains through my pupils. I blinked away tears, desperately scanning my surroundings. Everything appeared normal. The sedan continued ahead of me. The pickup truck's taillights glowed steadily in the distance. My dashboard instruments displayed their usual readings, except for the temperature gauge, which had returned to 42 degrees. The radio fell silent mid-beep. I might have convinced myself I'd experienced some kind of waking dream, a micro-sleep episode perhaps, except for what I saw on the road surface to my right. 2 parallel grooves had been carved into the asphalt, fresh enough that small curls of road material still protruded from their edges. The marks ran perfectly alongside my truck, as though something massive had been dragged or had walked beside me. Where the lanes curved, so did the marks, maintaining a precise distance from my vehicle's path. I radioed for emergency services, but received only static in response. When I tried to call out to the other drivers using the CB, no one answered. The other vehicles maintained their speed, never slowing or showing any sign that their occupants had noticed the momentary blackout. As I approached the 3-mile marker, the radio crackled back to life. This time I recognized fragments of the Morse transmission. Semi, Blue, Denver, 6-way, Salt Lake. My truck was blue. I was heading from Denver to Salt Lake for a 6 a.m. delivery. The code was describing my route, my vehicle, my schedule. Information that had been determined hours ago, long before I entered the tunnel. My mouth went dry. A tremor worked its way up from my hands to my shoulders. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I pressed the accelerator, eager to put Blackridge behind me, but my increased speed seemed to trigger another response in the tunnel. The overhead lights began to flicker, not all at once but in sequence, creating a strobing effect that tracked my movement westward. The Morse code accelerated again, this time translating into geographic coordinates. With growing horror, I realized they pinpointed locations along my planned route. Rest stops I intended to use, the diner where I usually grabbed coffee, even the specific terminal at my destination. How could anyone know these details? I hadn't shared my exact route with dispatch. Some stops were personal preferences, decisions made on the fly. The cold that had briefly receded returned, this time from within my chest, spreading outward until my fingertips tingled with numbness. At the 3.5-mile marker, I noticed movement in my side mirror. The parallel grooves in the road were changing direction, gradually angling toward my truck. Whatever had created those marks was no longer content to travel alongside me. It was moving closer. The smell of coal intensified again. Black liquid began to seep from the grooves in the asphalt, bubbling up like fresh tar, but moving against gravity, forming rivulets that flowed uphill. My eyes darted between the road ahead and the side mirror, tracking the inexorable approach of those mysterious tracks. At the 3.8-mile marker, I felt the first impact, subtle but unmistakable. Something solid brushed against my trailer. The entire rig shuddered as though I'd hit a patch of rough road, but the tunnel surface remained smooth. The contact came again, more deliberate this time, a massive weight leaning into my trailer, testing its resistance. The radio screamed with Morse code now, the message changing to a single phrase repeated endlessly. You see nothing, you hear nothing, you know nothing. But I did see. In the side mirror, the trailer's metal skin began to deform, massive indentations appearing in rhythmic patterns, like fingerprints pressed into clay. The impressions moved up the side of the trailer toward the cab. Whatever created them remained invisible, but its effects on physical reality were undeniable. I abandoned all pretense of maintaining the speed limit. My speedometer climbed past 70 mph, dangerously fast for the tunnel's confines. The exit appeared ahead, a perfect circle of night sky framed by concrete. Just a quarter-mile more. The sedan ahead had vanished. The pickup truck's taillights no longer shone in the distance. Had they escaped already? Or had they never been real at all? As I neared the exit, the overhead lights began to dim again. Not all at once like before, but gradually, as though being drained of power. The darkness pursued me, a wave of shadow rolling from east to west, gaining speed as it consumed each light fixture. In the growing darkness, I saw it for the first time, not directly, but as a distortion in the air beside my truck. A heat mirage effect that bent light around something massive moving parallel to my vehicle. The shape suggested impossible dimensions, too tall for the tunnel's height, too broad for the lane it occupied, yet somehow conforming to the space available. It rippled and shifted, occasionally solidifying enough to suggest a limb or appendage before dissolving back into transparency. The Morse code changed one final time, translating to geographic coordinates I recognized with cold dread, my home address. That revelation broke something in me. Primal fear overrode all trucker safety protocols. I floored the accelerator, pushing the rig to its mechanical limits. The engine roared in protest as the speedometer needle trembled past 90 mph. The wave of darkness closed the gap, swallowing the last lights between me and the exit. This blackout lasted only 2 seconds, not 7, before I burst from the western portal into the night air of the mountain pass. The stars overhead seemed impossibly bright after the tunnel's oppressive atmosphere. I didn't slow down until I'd put 5 miles between myself and Blackridge. When I finally pulled into a rest area, my clothes were soaked with sweat, my knuckles white from gripping the wheel. I reported the incident to the highway patrol. They sent a maintenance team to investigate but found nothing unusual. No power failures had been recorded that night. No gouges marked the tunnel floor. The officer suggested fatigue might have caused me to hallucinate, a common enough occurrence among long-haul drivers pushing their limits. I completed my delivery on time, though my hands trembled as I signed off on the manifest. I told myself it was over, a bizarre episode never to be repeated. 3 days later, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in dots and dashes, Morse code. I didn't need to translate it to know what it said. The message had been burned into my memory during those 7 seconds of darkness. I no longer take the Blackridge Tunnel. I no longer drive at night. Some shortcuts aren't worth the time they save. Sometimes I wonder about the other vehicles in the tunnel that night. The sedan, the pickup, The distant semi. Did their drivers experience the same phenomenon? Or were they part of it somehow, lures to draw me deeper into the mountain? Whatever waits in Black Ridge is patient. It knows my route, my schedule, my home. It communicates in code and moves unseen, leaving marks that disappear when others look for them. Sometimes I wake at precisely 2:37 a.m., the exact time I entered the tunnel that Sunday, to find my radio crackling with faint rhythmic beeps. On those nights, I don't need to look out the window to know what I'd see. Fresh grooves in my driveway, parallel lines moving toward my front door, still wet with something that smells of coal. They say the mountain passages were carved through ancient ground, disturbing what had rested there for millennia. Professional drivers share stories of lost time, phantom vehicles, and radio transmissions from stations that don't exist. But none stay on the road long after encountering what dwells in the shadows between the walls of rock. I've given my notice. Next week I start a desk job with a logistics company. The pay is worse, but I'll be home every night with the lights on, doors locked, radio unplugged. And if you're reading this as you approach the eastern entrance of Black Ridge Tunnel, I have only one piece of advice. Turn around. No schedule is worth meeting what waits in those 7 seconds of darkness. Story 9. The first grain of sand appeared on my workbench 3 weeks after I acquired the hourglass. Just one grain, impossibly out of place beneath the harsh LED magnifier. I swept it away without a second thought, a mistake that haunts me still. I didn't understand what the tide was bringing in. My name is Thomas Merrick. For 27 years, I've restored timepieces in this converted boathouse at the edge of Blackwater Harbor. Watches and clocks passed through my hands, their mechanisms laid bare, their secrets revealed under my tools. Until the hourglass, I believed I understood time's boundaries. It arrived in a shipment from an estate auction in Provincetown, a 19th century hourglass encased in darkened oak and tarnished brass. The auction catalog listed it as Maritime Chronometer, Sand, circa 1850. No mention of its provenance or the strange patina on its glass chambers. The price was fair, the craftsmanship exquisite. I should have questioned why no other collectors bid against me. The first peculiarity revealed itself during my initial examination. The sand was not the expected white quartz, but a deep gray-black mixture that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. When I tested its flow by turning the hourglass, the sand descended in perfect rivulets, almost viscous in its movement. I timed the flow, exactly 12 minutes, regardless of orientation. Consistent, reliable, precise. 3 days later, I noticed the first anomaly. The sand had formed what appeared to be characters, not quite letters, not quite symbols, along the inner wall of the lower chamber. I dismissed it as particulate clumping, a common occurrence in antique hourglasses with moisture damage. I inverted the instrument to test the flow again. As the sand descended, it didn't merely pile at the bottom, it arranged itself. The dark grains formed what could only be described as a topographic map. Concentric rings and irregular shorelines I recognized immediately as Marblehead Harbor, where I had spent my childhood summers at my grandfather's cottage. The precision was unnerving. Every inlet, every rocky outcropping perfectly rendered in miniature. I contacted the auction house, inquiring about the previous owner. Their response was perfunctory. An elderly gentleman with no family, his belongings liquidated to cover end-of-life care. No, they had no record of the hourglass's history. No, they couldn't provide additional details about the former owner. Their curtness suggested the matter was closed. That night, I dreamt of tides. Not the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, but the inexorable pull of deep currents dragging me out to sea. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m. From downstairs came a sound I couldn't immediately identify, a steady susurration like fine particles cascading onto a hard surface. My workshop was dark when I descended the stairs, flashlight clutched in my trembling hand. The beam caught dust motes floating in the air, unnaturally dense. The sound grew louder as I approached my workbench, a continuous pour, as if someone had upended a container of sand. But when I switched on the overhead lights, The noise ceased immediately. The hourglass stood exactly where I had left it, the sand now collected in the bottom chamber. But surrounding it on the polished oak surface was a perfect circle of the same dark sand, not piled, but arranged in a precise ring. I touched it, rubbing the grains between my fingers. They were cold and slightly damp, as if recently retrieved from underwater. I swept the sand into a small glass vial and sealed it, intending to have it analyzed. I placed the hourglass in a locked cabinet, more out of unease than concern for its value. The next morning, the vial was empty. Not a single grain remained inside, though the seal was intact. On my workbench, the hourglass had somehow migrated back to its previous position, despite the locked cabinet showing no signs of tampering. The sand now depicted a different coastline, the hooked peninsula of Cape Cod, its distinctive curl unmistakable even in this miniature form. My colleague Marcus suggested over the phone that old hourglasses sometimes contained specialized sand mixtures, magnetized iron filings or treated quartz that could respond to environmental factors. His explanation was rational but insufficient. It didn't account for the specific geographic rendering, nor the hourglass's apparent ability to escape confinement. I considered selling it, even destroying it, but something prevented me. An unnatural fixation had taken root. I found myself staring at the flowing sand for hours, watching it create and recreate familiar coastlines, places I had visited in my youth, beaches where I had collected shells, rock-bound coves where I had fished with my grandfather. The hourglass knew where I had been. A week after its arrival, I woke to the sound of water. Not dripping, not flowing, but the rhythmic surge of tides beneath the floorboards of my workshop. My home stands on pilings over solid ground, not water. A fact I repeated to myself as I descended the stairs, flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. The sound stopped abruptly when I reached the bottom step. In the silence that followed, I heard only my own ragged breathing and the distant foghorn from the harbor mouth. I swept the flashlight beam across the floor, catching a peculiar shimmer near the north wall. As I approached, the beam revealed a thin line of sand extending from under the baseboard, tracking across the floor in a meandering path. I followed the trail to its end and found myself facing my workbench. The hourglass stood central among my tools, the sand within now swirling without being turned, creating and dissolving patterns like clouds viewed from above. The trail on the floor continued directly to the bench's edge, then up its side, grains adhering impossibly to the vertical surface until they reached the hourglass base. My hand shook as I reached for the light switch. The overhead fluorescence flickered to life, and the sand trail disintegrated, grains scattering as if blown by an unfelt wind. Sleep became a distant memory. I installed motion-activated cameras in the workshop, their infrared capability capturing the darkness that seemed to intensify around the hourglass. For 3 nights they recorded nothing unusual, just the occasional mouse or the shadow of tree branches against the windows. On the 4th night, all 3 cameras failed simultaneously at precisely 3:17 a.m. When they reactivated an hour later, the hourglass had moved again, now positioned at the center of my desk calendar, covering the date of my grandfather's drowning 30 years earlier. My rational mind offered explanations. Coincidence, fatigue-induced paranoia, perhaps even early-onset dementia. I scheduled an appointment with my doctor, who found nothing physically wrong beyond elevated blood pressure and insomnia. He prescribed sleeping pills I never took. Chemical unconsciousness seemed more dangerous than vigilance. The intrusions escalated. Sand appeared everywhere, in my coffee, between the pages of books, filling the drains until they backed up with brackish water. The hourglass now moved freely throughout the house, appearing in locations impossible to reach without a ladder or tools. I would find it perched atop bookshelves, balanced on door frames, once even suspended from a light fixture by filaments of sand that broke apart at my touch. 2 weeks after the hourglass arrived, I heard footsteps for the first time. The sound came at the now familiar hour of 3:17 a.m. Not the creaking of an old house settling, but deliberate footfalls on the workshop floor. Heavy, dragging steps that left behind perfect footprints in sand that hadn't been there when I locked up. Bare feet, larger than my own, their impression deep as if bearing significant weight. The prints led to my workbench, circled it 3 times, then simply stopped, as if whoever made them had vanished or been absorbed into the wood itself. I began leaving notes for myself on the workbench each night, testing my memory against the increasingly fragmented perception of time. The hourglass is in the cabinet, 11:42 p.m. In the morning, the note would be altered, additional words inserted in handwriting that resembled my own, just enough to seed doubt. The hourglass is in the cabinet where it must remain until the tide returns. 11:42 p.m. becomes 3:17, a.m. becomes eternity. I consulted a local historian about the region's maritime past, carefully avoiding any mention of my experiences. She spoke of shipwrecks along the coast, of navigation aided by hourglasses when stars were obscured. She mentioned sailors' superstitions, timepieces that stopped at the moment of disaster, chronometers that predicted storms. Then she asked why I was trembling. I left without answering. Last night the footprints returned, but with a difference. They no longer manifested as sand, but as wet depressions in the wooden floor, as if someone had emerged dripping from the ocean and walked directly to my workbench. The wood grain darkened around each impression, water seeping up rather than down. I followed them to their end and found the hourglass waiting. The sand within had formed not a coastline this time, but a perfect rendering of a human face, my grandfather's face, exactly as I remembered him from childhood, down to the scar bisecting his left eyebrow. I reached for the hourglass, my fingers brushing its cold brass frame. The face dissolved instantly, the sand collapsing into formlessness. Then it began to swirl again, faster now, a miniature maelstrom contained within glass. It shaped itself into words I could almost read, symbols that hovered at the edge of comprehension. Something about depths, something about returning, something about time flowing in both directions. The floor beneath me creaked, a sound not of settling timber, but of wood straining against rising pressure. The persistent sound of tide that had haunted my nights grew louder, no longer coming from below but all around, as if the workshop itself were submerged. Water began seeping through the floorboards, not the clean transparency of rain or tap water, but dark and brackish, carrying the unmistakable scent of the sea. I stumbled back, watching in horror as the liquid pooled around the hourglass, not touching it, but circling like a predator, assessing its prey. The tide rose to my ankles, cold and insistent. I fled upstairs, listening to the water follow, not flowing but crawling up each step with deliberate purpose. Dawn found me huddled in the attic, surrounded by antique clocks collected over decades, their synchronized ticking a barrier against the silence that had replaced the tide's roar. When I finally descended, the workshop was dry, showing no evidence of flooding. The hourglass stood on my workbench, the sand within now perfectly divided between upper and lower chambers, an impossible equilibrium that defied gravity. Today, I write this account while watching the sand remain suspended between worlds. I've searched maritime records, consulted experts in horology and oceanography, even contacted a paranormal investigator whose card I found pinned to the community bulletin board. No one has answers that satisfy both the evidence of my senses and the boundaries of reason. The sun is setting now, casting long shadows across my workshop. Soon it will be 3:17 a.m. again. I've packed a bag with essentials, planning to leave before the tide returns. But as I write these final words, I notice something I've overlooked until now. The brass plate on the hourglass base bears an inscription nearly worn away by time and handling. Under strong magnification, I can just make out the words, "Time and tide wait for no man, but both return for what belongs to the deep." The sand within the hourglass has begun to move again, forming itself into a new shape. Not a coastline or a face, but a perfect miniature replica of my workshop, complete with a tiny figure bent over a workbench. Me. As I watch, another figure takes shape behind the first, its hand outstretched toward the back of the miniature watchmaker's neck. A familiar hand, bearing my grandfather's distinctive ring. I will not be here when the tide returns tonight. Whether I can outrun what follows me remains to be seen, but I understand now that the hourglass was never merely keeping time. It was keeping me. For what purpose, I cannot say. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the coastal waters of my childhood, or perhaps in the depths that claimed my grandfather. One certainty remains. Whatever crosses the threshold between worlds when the tide flows beneath my floor has been waiting for decades, its patience measured one grain of sand at a time. And it knows exactly where to find me. Story 10. The window vibrated beneath my fingertips with a rhythm that reminded me of a sleeping pulse. Slow, deliberate, alive. That was impossible, of course. Glass doesn't pulse. Glass doesn't breathe. But as I hung suspended on my platform outside the 23rd floor of the Meridian Tower, the evidence trembled against my skin, defying everything I knew about buildings and physics and reality itself. My name is Daniel Mercer, and after 15 years of painting high-rises across 3 states, I thought I'd seen every structural anomaly possible. Cracks that appeared overnight, mysterious leaks with no source, even once a beehive somehow built between double-paned windows. But nothing prepared me for what waited behind the seemingly ordinary reflective glass panel on the eastern face of Chicago's newest commercial skyscraper. The job had started routinely enough. Meridian Development had hired my company to address reports of water seepage on the exterior of their prestigious new tower, barely 6 months after completion. The project manager explained in hushed tones that the situation was embarrassing but urgent. Tenants on several floors had complained about dampness near the windows during the last heavy rainfall. My task was simple: identify potential entry points and apply industrial-grade sealant before the building's reputation suffered further damage. For 3 days, I worked methodically from the top down, my platform descending floor by floor as I checked seams and applied silicone where needed. The building was an architectural marvel, all gleaming steel and perfectly uniform glass panels, reflecting the city skyline like a vertical mirror. By the 3rd day, I'd reached the 23rd floor and had settled into the comfortable rhythm of the work. The first anomaly I noticed was subtle. Unlike the other floors, the windows on the eastern section of 23 felt different against my gloved hand, slightly warmer than the surrounding panels despite the uniform morning shade. I made a note to check the thermal insulation but didn't think much of it until I began inspecting the 4th window from the northeast corner. At first glance, it looked identical to the others, a seamless reflective panel that showed distorted versions of neighboring buildings and passing clouds. But as I adjusted my platform to get a better angle, the reflection shifted. Instead of city sky, I saw what appeared to be the interior of an office space: filing cabinets, a desk, papers scattered across the floor. I blinked hard, assuming it was some strange optical illusion created by the angle of the sun. The illusion didn't disappear. If anything, it intensified. As I stared, the papers on the floor began to move, swirling in a circular pattern as if caught in an invisible whirlwind. A filing cabinet in the corner rocked slightly, its top drawer sliding open and shut with mechanical precision. There was no one visible inside, no human presence causing this movement, just objects behaving as if animated by an unseen force. My heart rate quickened as I pulled out my phone to document the phenomenon. But the camera captured only a normal reflection of the city, not the impossible scene I was witnessing with my naked eyes. I switched to video with the same result. Nothing unusual appeared on screen. When I looked up from my phone, the strange office tableau remained, now with papers flying more violently as if a powerful fan had been switched to its highest setting. I radioed down to Marco, my ground supervisor, asking if he could see anything unusual about the window I was working on. His voice crackled back, asking which window I meant since they all looked identical from below. When I tried to explain what I was seeing, he laughed and suggested I take a water break, blaming the heat for playing tricks on my perception. Maybe he was right. The late August temperature had climbed above 90 degrees, and despite my canteen, dehydration was always a risk in this job. Still, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the impossible scene. Sweat beaded on my forehead and dampened my blue coveralls as I continued to watch the phantom office space. Curiosity overcame caution. I removed my work glove and pressed my bare palm against the glass. The surface vibrated with that impossible organic pulse, slow and steady like a resting heartbeat. The sensation sent electric shivers up my arm and into my chest, causing my own heart to stutter in response. But it was what happened next that truly chilled my blood despite the summer heat. My reflection appeared in the glass, superimposed over the chaotic office scene, except it wasn't quite me. The figure wore a rust-colored coverall instead of my blue one. Its face, my face, was partially obscured by shadow, though there was nothing above me that could cast such darkness. When I raised my hand, the reflection moved a split second too late, as if responding to me rather than mirroring my actions. I jerked away from the glass, nearly losing my balance on the platform. My breathing came in short, painful gasps as I gripped the safety railing, knuckles white with strain. This wasn't possible. This wasn't happening. Yet when I forced myself to look again, the scene remained. Papers whirling like autumn leaves in a tornado, furniture rocking, and that almost me watching from inside. The rational part of my brain demanded explanations. Perhaps this was an elaborate prank using projectors. Maybe stress and heat had combined to trigger some form of hallucination. I fumbled for my water bottle, gulping lukewarm liquid while trying to steady my thoughts. After a few minutes of controlled breathing, I radioed Marco again, this time requesting the building plans for the 23rd floor. He seemed confused by my insistence but agreed to ask the site manager. 20 minutes later, my radio crackled with Marco's voice informing me that according to the plans, there was no office space behind that section of the 23rd floor. The area behind those windows was designated as a structural void, just support beams and a narrow maintenance passage. No one could possibly be occupying that space. A cold weight settled in my stomach despite the heat. I should have immediately reported the anomaly and moved on to the next section. That's what any reasonable person would do. Instead, I found myself drawn back to the window, compelled by a curiosity that overrode my growing fear. This time I noticed something new. The chaotic movement inside had a pattern to it. The papers circled counterclockwise, the cabinet drawers opened and closed in sequences of 3, and occasionally, a chair would spin exactly 180 degrees before stopping abruptly. The movements weren't random. They were rhythmic, almost ritualistic, and my distorted reflection observed it all with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between fascination and dread. I pressed my hand against the glass again, and the pulsation synchronized with my heartbeat, quickening as my anxiety rose. The reflection's lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I found myself leaning closer, straining to understand, when a sharp cracking sound made me jerk backward. A hairline fracture had appeared in the glass beneath my palm, spreading outward like a spider's web frozen in mid-creation. I pulled my hand away in horror as the crack continued to expand, not breaking through but creating an intricate pattern across the surface. The design wasn't random. It formed symbols I almost recognized but couldn't name, arcane geometries that hurt my eyes to follow. My radio suddenly emitted a blast of static so loud I nearly dropped it. Through the white noise, I could barely make out Marco's voice asking if I was all right. When I responded, my own voice sounded distant and unfamiliar. I managed to report an issue with the window but found myself minimizing what I'd seen, mentioning only the crack and saying nothing about the impossible room or my altered reflection. Some deep instinct warned me that sharing the full truth would only make things worse, that naming this phenomenon might somehow give it power. Marco instructed me to mark the window for the glass repair team and move on to the next section. Simple, reasonable instructions that I should have followed immediately. Instead, I found myself lingering, transfixed by the silent drama unfolding behind the cracked glass. The fracture pattern had stabilized, but now seemed to pulse with a dim luminescence that brightened and faded in time with the vibrations. My reflection appeared more distinct now, the shadows retreating enough to reveal subtle differences in my features. Slightly deeper set eyes, a thin scar across the forehead I didn't possess, an expression of knowing anticipation. Time seemed to distort as I stared. Minutes stretched like hours, the sun barely moving across the sky despite what felt like an eternity of watching. The sounds of the city below faded until all I could hear was my own breathing and heartbeat, synchronizing gradually with the pulse of the glass. A thought surfaced through my mounting dread. Whatever existed behind this window was aware of me, was responding to my presence. My trance broke only when the platform jerked suddenly beneath me. I looked down to see it being mechanically retracted, Marco having apparently triggered the emergency recall after my prolonged silence. As the distance between me and the window increased, I could have sworn I saw my reflection press its hand against the other side of the glass, its mouth opening in what might have been a silent plea or warning. Back on solid ground, I gave a heavily edited account of finding a structurally compromised window. When asked about my unusual behavior, I blamed dehydration and agreed to take the rest of the day off. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the swirling papers, the rocking furniture, the cracked glass forming impossible symbols, and most disturbingly, my almost but not quite reflection watching me from an office that couldn't exist. The following morning, I called in sick for the first time in 5 years. The site manager left a voicemail expressing concern, but assuring me they'd assigned another technician to continue the inspection. That knowledge should have brought relief. Instead, it filled me with inexplicable dread. By evening, restlessness drove me back to the Meridian Tower. I stood across the street, counting up to the 23rd floor, searching for the window that had haunted my thoughts. Even from this distance, I could distinguish it, not by sight, but by a feeling of wrongness that emanated from its exact location. As dusk settled over the city, I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. A dim light flickered behind that window, though the surrounding floor remained dark. Security footage later recovered would show me entering the building at 9:17 p.m., using the contractor access code to bypass the night guard. Elevator logs recorded my ascent to the 23rd floor. What happened after I stepped into the darkened hallway was pieced together only through circumstantial evidence and my own fragmented recollections. I remember finding the corresponding interior wall where the window should have been accessible. As expected, there was nothing but smooth drywall, painted the uniform gray of unoccupied office space. The building plans hadn't lied. No room existed here, just wall and beyond it, the structural void. Yet when I placed my palm against the wall, I felt that now familiar vibration. The surface felt wrong. Not solid like drywall, but membrane thin and yielding. My phone's flashlight revealed nothing unusual, but my fingers detected hairline cracks matching the pattern I'd seen on the exterior glass. What compelled me to press harder, I cannot say. Curiosity? Compulsion? Whatever the reason, the wall gave way beneath my touch, not breaking but parting like curtains, revealing a space that defied architectural possibility. The office I entered existed in a dimensional pocket that shouldn't fit within the building's structural parameters. Papers circled in their perpetual whirlwind. Cabinets rocked rhythmically. And standing across the room, wearing rust-colored coveralls, was my reflection, my double, separated from the window for the first time. No words passed between us. None were needed. I understood with inexplicable certainty that we were the same person divided across some boundary of reality, and that the violent chaos of this impossible room represented the fracturing of that boundary. For how long we had been separated, I couldn't guess, but the relief in my doppelganger's eyes suggested an eternity of waiting. When he extended his hand, I took it without hesitation. The moment our palms touched, the whirlwind of papers froze in midair. The furniture stopped its restless movement. Silence descended, profound and complete. The integration wasn't painful, more like remembering something long forgotten. Memories that weren't mine yet, somehow were filtered into my consciousness. Alternative choices, paths not taken, a lifetime of experiences parallel to my own. We had been separated during the building's construction, reality splitting like light through a prism due to some quantum anomaly created by the tower's unusual materials. I left the Meridian Tower that night outwardly unchanged. The security camera captured my exit at 10:42 p.m., my expression calm, my gait steady. The guard noticed nothing unusual except perhaps my coveralls, which appeared somewhat darker than before. I returned to work 3 days later, declining offers to reassign me from the Meridian project. The window on the 23rd floor had been replaced, showing nothing but ordinary reflections to anyone who looked. No one questioned the missing maintenance reports for that section, or why the replacement glass had been ordered a week before the crack was officially discovered. Sometimes, late at night, I stand across from the tower and look up at the 23rd floor. The window remains dark, as it should. But occasionally, if the angle is just right, I catch a glimpse of movement behind the glass. Not the chaotic whirlwind of before, but a singular, purposeful presence. I raise my hand in greeting, and somewhere in the glass, a reflection that is no longer separate does the same. We are whole now, integrated. But the memory of separation remains, along with the knowledge that the barrier between what is and what could be is far thinner than anyone suspects. And sometimes, in dreams or quiet moments, I see through eyes that aren't quite mine, to other windows on other floors, where other reflections wait, watching for someone to notice the impossibility of their existence and reach through the glass to make them whole again. Story 11. The first rule of firefighting is that smoke rises. Always has, always will. Physics doesn't bend, doesn't break, until it does. I'd spent 30 years watching smoke climb walls and curl against ceilings. But what crawled toward me across the faded carpet of the Grand Meridian Hotel didn't obey the laws I'd built my life around. It hugged the floor like liquid mercury, deliberate in its movement, conscious in its exploration. And that was just the beginning of what was wrong with it. My name is Daniel Mercer. After 3 decades with the Chicago Fire Department, I'd seen enough smoke to last 10 lifetimes. Now I consulted on fire suppression systems, a retirement gig that kept my hands busy and my mind from dwelling on things best forgotten. The Grand Meridian job should have been routine, a historic Art Deco hotel built in 1934, recently acquired by some hospitality conglomerate with deep pockets and grand renovation plans. Before gutting the place, they needed the existing systems evaluated. Enter the old firefighter with his clipboard and pressure gauges. The hotel had been closed to guests for 3 months. The manager, a thin man with nervous hands named Elridge, had given me access cards to all areas and explicit instructions not to disturb the few remaining staff preparing for the upcoming demolition work. The building carried the musty scent of neglect beneath its faded glamour, like an aging starlet still wearing last decade's makeup. I'd already spent 2 days mapping the sprinkler system, making notes about ancient pipes and outdated hardware. Today was for pressure testing. The 7th floor had been converted to storage sometime in the 90s. The long corridors were flanked by guest rooms repurposed as miniature warehouses, filled with extra furniture, outdated electronics, and stacks of promotional materials from events long past. The sprinkler system here was especially antiquated, with pipes that groaned like dying animals when I opened the main valve for the pressure test. That's when I first noticed it. A wisp of white smoke seeping from beneath a door marked electrical. My first thought was that I'd created a pressure leak that had somehow damaged wiring. But there was no smell of burning plastic, no acrid tang that accompanies electrical fires. Just that white smoke, unnaturally dense and moving with impossible deliberation across the carpet toward me. The smoke didn't rise or dissipate. Instead, it pooled around my boots, swirling like curious fingers. My skin prickled beneath my clothes, not from heat, but from a deep-seated wrongness that triggered ancient survival instincts. I'd brought a multi-gas detector, standard procedure for enclosed spaces, and pulled it from my belt. The readout remained steady. No carbon monoxide, no unusual oxygen levels, nothing toxic in the air. According to the equipment, the smoke didn't exist. But it was there, coiling around my ankles now, tendrils separating and rejoining like a living organism studying its prey. I stepped back, and it followed, matching my movements with unnerving precision. When I swept my hand through it, the smoke parted momentarily before reforms, now moving with greater agitation. The texture was wrong too. Smoke should be ephemeral, dissolving at the slightest disturbance. This had substance, an almost gelatinous resistance when disturbed, like pushing through cold cobwebs, and within its depths, I could make out shapes, inverted flames frozen in mid-flicker, negative images of fire caught in still frame. I've seen fire in all its forms, the lazy orange of burning paper, the blue-white intensity of gas flames, the dark roiling of oil smoke. This wasn't fire, but it was a memory of fire, a ghost of combustion that had never occurred. The maintenance office was nearby. I backed toward it, unwilling to turn my back on the phenomenon that continued to pursue me with deliberate patience. Inside, I found what I needed, an ultraviolet inspection light used to detect fluid leaks. If this smoke contained any particulates, the UV light might reveal its composition. When I directed the purple beam at the smoke now seeping under the door, my breath caught painfully in my chest. The UV light didn't illuminate the smoke. It transformed it. What had been white now glowed with a sickly greenish-blue luminescence. And beneath my feet, the carpet where I had walked revealed my path in glowing embers, footprints burning without consuming the fabric, without generating heat. Each step I'd taken left a ghostly imprint of fire that should not exist. Even on the sections of carpet I'd deliberately soaked during the pressure test, the phantom flames persisted, impossibly burning on saturated fabric. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sweat formed on my forehead despite the chill that had descended over the corridor. I was familiar with fear. Every firefighter is. But this was different. This was the vertigo of reality coming unmoored, of fundamental certainties dissolving. I retreated to the stairwell, needing distance, needing to think. The smoke didn't follow immediately, but I could see it exploring the crack beneath the heavy fire door, probing for entry. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone. No service. The thick concrete walls of the old building blocking signals. The hotel manager had mentioned a skeleton maintenance crew on the 3rd floor. I descended rapidly, the sound of my boots on metal steps echoing upward. Each landing I passed bore the hotel's ornate insignia embedded in the floor tiles, an elaborate M surrounded by stylized flames. The irony wasn't lost on me. On the 3rd floor, I found only empty workstations and abandoned tools. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on a desk, still warm to the touch. According to the work logs open on a nearby clipboard, 3 maintenance workers should have been here. But the floor was deserted, silent except for the distant hum of the building's ancient electrical systems. I made my way to the security office, hoping to find someone there, or at least a working phone. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glow of multiple monitors showing grainy feeds from throughout the building. Most displayed empty hallways and vacant spaces. On one screen, I could make out the 7th floor corridor I'd fled. The white smoke was now flowing freely from the electrical room, pooling across the floor like milk spilled from a carton, but moving with undeniable purpose. Another monitor showed what appeared to be the hotel's boiler room. 3 figures in maintenance uniforms stood motionless, their backs to the camera, facing a section of wall where more of the white smoke seeped from between pipes. They hadn't moved in the minutes I'd been watching, standing unnaturally still, as if frozen in time. My mouth went dry. I tried the desk phone. Dead. A crackle from the security radio drew my attention. Through bursts of static, I could make out words. Containment failing. Original parameters exceeded. Recommend immediate evacuation. The transmission ended abruptly. I adjusted dials, trying to re-establish contact, when movement on one of the monitors caught my eye. The smoke on the 7th floor was no longer formless. It had gathered itself into a vaguely humanoid shape, its head tilted upward as if sniffing the air. Then it turned, directly toward the camera, and I could see what approximated a face forming in its depths. Hollow eye sockets and a gaping mouth, composed not of features but of those same frozen, negative image flames. A surge of primal terror shot through me. My breath came in short gasps as I backed away from the monitor. I needed to get out, to contact someone. The management company, the fire department, anyone. I hurried down to the main floor, taking stairs 2 at a time despite the protest from my aging knees. The grand lobby stretched before me, an expansive space of marble floors and Art Deco fixtures, once magnificent but now draped in plastic sheeting and surrounded by construction materials. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the space. The main entrance was chained shut, a large sign announcing the upcoming renovation. I moved toward the service exit at the far end of the lobby. As I crossed the space, I noticed my footprints appearing behind me on the marble, glowing embers marking my path, though no UV light illuminated them now. The phenomenon was spreading, following me throughout the building. Before I could reach the exit, I noticed something on the floor, a maintenance worker's ID badge. Picking it up, I saw the photo of a middle-aged man with a graying beard. The name read Howard Dennings, and the issue date was 1986. The plastic was yellowed with age, impossible for a current employee. The sound of rushing water drew my attention. From the grand staircase that dominated the lobby, water was flowing down each step, soaking into the protective coverings over the carpet. I moved closer, my firefighter's instincts overriding my fear. At the top of the stairs stood one of the maintenance workers I'd seen on the security monitor, hose in hand, methodically soaking the staircase. His movements were mechanical, his eyes vacant. When I called out to him, he gave no indication of hearing me. As water pooled at the bottom of the stairs, the white smoke began to form there as well, rising from the puddles like steam in reverse, clinging to the floor rather than rising. And where the smoke touched, those same ember-like footprints began to appear. Dozens of them, overlapping, moving in patterns across the lobby floor. The footprints of people long gone. I backed away, colliding with a plastic-covered armchair. My hands were trembling violently now, a cold sweat drenching my shirt. The maintenance worker continued his mechanical task, oblivious to my presence or the impossibility forming below him. A crackling voice came from somewhere nearby. The worker's radio, I realized. Through the static, I heard, "The pressure's building again. It's been 40 years. We can't hold it back anymore." 40 years. With sudden clarity, I remembered reading about the Grand Meridian in training, a case study in outdated fire prevention systems. In 1984, a fire had started in the boiler room, killing several maintenance workers before being contained. The hotel had managed to suppress the story, keeping the deaths quiet while renovating the damaged areas. The official report cited faulty wiring, but rumors had persisted of negligence, of warnings ignored. The smoke was spreading now, flowing from every water-soaked surface in the lobby. Within its depths, I could see more shapes forming, human silhouettes moving with deliberate purpose, reenacting some long-ago event. Their feet didn't touch the ground but hovered inches above it, the negative space between them and the floor filled with those frozen flame patterns. My back pressed against the reception desk as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The maintenance worker had disappeared from the top of the stairs. In his place stood a figure composed entirely of the white smoke, more defined than the others, staring down at me with hollow sockets where eyes should be. A sound filled the lobby then, a deep, resonant tone like the feedback from a microphone, building in intensity until it vibrated through my bones. The smoke figures all turned toward me in unison, their blank faces somehow conveying accusation. The pressure gauge on my belt began to spin wildly, the needle whipping past its maximum reading. From somewhere deep in the building came a groaning of metal under strain, the ancient pipes of the sprinkler system protesting as pressure beyond their capacity built within. I understood then. This wasn't a haunting in the traditional sense. It was physics breaking down at a fundamental level, potential energy from a fire that had been contained but never truly extinguished, pressure that had been building for decades in systems never designed to hold it. The hotel hadn't just covered up deaths, it had somehow bottled the very event itself, trapped it within its infrastructure. And now, with the systems finally being tested after years of neglect, that contained energy was finding release. The sprinklers above burst to life, spraying water across the lobby. But where the droplets fell, they didn't splash or wet the surfaces. Instead, they froze in midair, suspended momentarily before transforming into more of the white smoke, feeding the growing phenomenon. I ran for the service door, no longer caring about understanding, focused only on escape. As I reached for the handle, the smoke rushed toward me, faster than before, surrounding me in a cocoon of its cold, gelatinous substance. Within the white void, I saw faces forming and dissolving. Men in maintenance uniforms, their expressions frozen in terror as they realized what was happening in the boiler room 40 years ago. They weren't trying to harm me, I realized. They were trying to warn me. The pressure was building again, just as it had before. The renovations, the testing of old systems, it was creating the same conditions that had led to disaster decades ago. With desperate strength, I pushed through the smoke and burst through the service door into the alley behind the hotel. The afternoon sun struck my face, momentarily blinding me. I stumbled forward, gasping clean air into burning lungs. When I turned back, the door showed no sign of the phenomenon. No smoke seeped through its cracks. No phantom flames marked its surface. But as I backed away, I noticed my footprints on the concrete, glowing with ember-like intensity despite the bright sunlight, marking my path away from the Grand Meridian. And I knew with bone-deep certainty that I carried something out with me, something that had attached itself to my presence. A residual burn that would never quite fade, a reminder of physics broken and energy contained but never truly dispelled. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, signal bars now strong in the open air. I didn't call the management company. Instead, I dialed the fire marshal's office. They needed to evacuate the surrounding blocks immediately. The pressure was still building inside, and this time there would be no containing what was about to be released. As I spoke, I watched the final ember-like footprint I'd left slowly fade from the concrete. But I could feel it still. The cold touch of that smoke, waiting patient as death in the spaces between moments, in the pressure behind walls, in the memory of flames that never had the chance to truly burn. Story 12. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in perfect synchronicity with my pulse, a fact I didn't notice until my third visit. By then, it was too late. The courthouse basement had already begun to claim me, inch by inch, heartbeat by heartbeat. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I am, or was, a respected contracts attorney with Fisher, Block & Associates. 3 weeks ago, Judge Carlton assigned me to catalog decades of misplaced evidence files that had accumulated in the courthouse's sub-basement archives. A punishment disguised as an honor. The assignment came after I'd challenged one of his rulings too aggressively. "Someone with your attention to detail," he'd said with thinly veiled contempt, "should find this enlightening." I remember my first descent clearly. The elevator dropped past the usual basement level, continuing downward with a grinding protest that seemed to emanate from deep within the building's bones. When it finally shuddered to a halt, the doors revealed a narrow corridor ending at a heavy metal door marked simply Archives. Nothing unusual, just the neglected underbelly of an aging municipal building. Beyond that door, however, waited the antechamber. 6 identical gray doors arranged in a perfect hexagon. No doorknobs, no markings, no distinguishing features whatsoever. Just flat, matte gray surfaces recessed slightly into concrete walls. The overhead lighting panels cast harsh shadows that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of my eye. A single metal desk sat in the center of the room, bearing only an ancient sign-in ledger and a chipped ceramic mug filled with pens. The clerk who had accompanied me, a sallow-faced man whose name I never caught, gestured vaguely around the room. "Archives are through there," he mumbled, already retreating toward the exit. "Sign in, sign out. Tap on the doors to open them." Before I could ask which door led where, he was gone. I approached the ledger and noted with unease that the last entry was dated nearly 6 months earlier. Signing my name, I moved toward the door directly ahead, hesitating before placing my palm against its cool surface. The door swung inward with a soft hiss, revealing rows of metal shelving vanishing into shadows. Nothing extraordinary at first. That day, I worked for hours organizing files, meticulously recording inventory numbers and case references. Standard, mind-numbing legal drudgery. When I finished for the evening, I closed the door behind me, signed out, and returned to the world above. On my second visit, I noticed the first anomaly. The antechamber contained only 5 doors. I blinked hard, turning slowly to confirm what my eyes were telling me. Where there had been 6 identical doors, now only 5 remained, spaced at perfect intervals, as if there had never been a 6th. The symmetry of the room remained undisturbed, its hexagonal shape now containing 5 entrances instead of 6, as if this had always been the arrangement. I approached the desk, checked the ledger. My previous entry remained, listing my entrance and exit times. Reassured somewhat, I proceeded to the same door I'd used before, or what I believed to be the same door, and continued my cataloging work. It was on my third visit that things began to truly unravel. 5 doors again greeted me, but as I signed the ledger, the lighting overhead began to flicker. At first, I attributed it to the building's aging electrical system, but as I stood still, heart racing from a sudden surge of inexplicable anxiety, I realized the terrible truth. The lights pulsed in perfect rhythm with my heartbeat, faster, then slower, as my own heart responded to this realization. The synchronicity was unmistakable, impossible, and yet undeniable. My hands trembled as I finished signing in, sweat beading across my forehead despite the perpetual chill of the room. And then, footsteps. Heavy and measured, they approached from behind me. I whirled around, expecting to find the clerk or perhaps a maintenance worker. The antechamber was empty, yet the footsteps continued, now circling the perimeter of the room. I tracked the sound, turning in place as it moved around me, always just out of sight. My mind raced through rational explanations, acoustics playing tricks, sounds carrying from elsewhere in the building, but none satisfied the primal fear gripping my chest. My eyes fell on a small security monitor I hadn't noticed before, mounted in the corner of the room. On its grainy screen, I could see myself standing by the desk, but something was wrong. The figure on the screen moved with a slight delay, turning his head seconds after I had already turned mine. I raised my hand experimentally. My image followed suit, but only after a noticeable pause. A warning system activated in my brain, urging me to flee, to forget the assignment and return to the world above. Instead, I approached one of the doors, placing my trembling palm against its surface. Cold air rushed through invisible seams around the door frame, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rain-soaked asphalt. Distant traffic sounds filtered through, car horns, the rumble of engines, even fragments of conversation. Impossible. The courthouse stood in the center of a plaza, with no roads directly adjacent, and we were at least 2 stories underground. I jerked my hand away, moving to another door. The same sensation greeted me, a street beyond where no street could possibly exist. Each door, when touched, revealed the same urban soundtrack, the same impossible connection to a world that shouldn't be accessible from here. Logic insisted I leave immediately, but professional obligation and a growing, irrational curiosity compelled me forward. I selected a door at random, pressed my palm firmly against it, and stepped through as it swung open. The archive room appeared normal, at first. Rows of shelving, boxes of files, the musty scent of old paper. I proceeded with my work, attempting to dismiss the anomalies as stress-induced hallucinations. An hour passed, then 2, as I methodically processed stacks of forgotten legal documents. When I reached for a particular folder, I noticed my hand was translucent. Not invisible. I could still see its outline, the suggestion of bones and veins beneath semi-transparent skin, but fading, becoming less substantial. The effect lasted only seconds before solidity returned, but the implication sent ice through my veins. I abandoned my work immediately, rushing back toward the door. It opened into the antechamber, but something had changed again. Now there were only 4 doors. The desk remained, but the ledger had transformed. My signature appeared on every line, stretching back through pages and pages of entries, each dated years apart, some so faded they were barely legible. Entries with my name dating back to 1973, 1954, 1938, decades before my birth. My reflection in the security monitor now lagged by nearly 10 seconds, the delayed image wearing an expression I didn't recognize, a knowing smile that never crossed my actual face. The footsteps returned, closer now, and accompanied by the sound of labored breathing. I spun in a complete circle, seeing nothing, yet feeling the unmistakable presence of something just behind my shoulder. A harsh whisper, almost subaudible. "You're getting closer." I fled to a door, any door, pressing my palm against it with desperate force. The street sounds beyond grew louder, more enticing. Rain, traffic, normality. I pushed through. But instead of an archive room, I entered a long, windowless corridor that couldn't possibly fit within the courthouse's dimensions. The walls were lined with thousands of manila folders, each bearing my name, each containing documents I had apparently signed. Contracts, affidavits, depositions, legal instruments I had no memory of executing, stretching infinitely before me. The corridor curved subtly, revealing more of itself as I advanced. The fluorescent lights continued their synchronized flickering with my increasingly erratic heartbeat, casting strobing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I reached for one of the folders, opening it with unsteady hands. Inside was a contract, apparently binding Daniel Mercer to catalog and maintain the archives for a period not measured in years or months, but in cycles. The signature at the bottom matched mine perfectly, though I had no recollection of signing such a document. The implications crashed over me in waves. How long had I been here? How many times had I made the same journey, forgotten, and repeated it? The evidence suggested a loop of some kind, a temporal trap in which I was both newcomer and long-term prisoner. I continued down the corridor, which eventually curved back on itself, forming a perfect circle. No exits, no other doors. Just an endless loop of documentation chronicling a servitude I couldn't remember agreeing to. When I finally returned to my starting point, exhausted and disoriented, a new door had appeared in the wall, unnumbered, unmarked, but distinctly different from the gray portals in the antechamber. This one was old wood, weathered and cracked, with a tarnished brass knob. Beside it stood a mirror I hadn't noticed before. In its reflection, I saw myself, but older, considerably older, with gray hair and deeply lined features. The reflection moved independently, gesturing toward the wooden door with urgent insistence. I approached cautiously, aware that the footsteps behind me had stopped. The air grew still, the flickering light steadied. My aged reflection mouthed words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Not yet. Not this cycle. Understanding dawned with terrible clarity. The archives weren't simply a storage facility for the courthouse's forgotten cases. They were a repository of something far more valuable. Time itself, perhaps, or fragments of reality that had slipped through cracks in the world above. And I was both cataloger and exhibit, filing away my own recurring experiences, alongside the legal detritus of decades. I turned away from the wooden door, from the promise of an exit that wasn't meant for me, not in this iteration. Instead, I retraced my steps to the circular antechamber, now containing just 3 doors. The security monitor showed my image with an even longer delay, now nearly 30 seconds behind my actual movements. The ledger on the desk had changed again. My signature remained on every line, but now each entry included a cryptic notation: cycle incomplete. All except the very first entry, dated 1897, which bore the single word, beginning. My rational mind struggled against these impossibilities, but a deeper part of me recognized the truth. I wasn't being punished by Judge Carlton. I was fulfilling a function far older than his petty judiciary grudge, a function I had apparently been performing for over a century. I selected one of the remaining doors, touching it lightly. The street sounds beyond seemed closer now, more detailed. I could distinguish individual conversations, the specific makes of cars from their engine notes, even catch fragments of music from passing vehicles. The door swung open, revealing not an archive room or impossible corridor, but a perfectly ordinary street scene, a rain-slicked avenue I recognized as being several blocks from the courthouse. Freedom, just steps away. Too simple, too convenient. I pulled back, letting the door swing shut. The other doors, when tested, revealed similar scenes. Different streets, different locations, but all offering apparent escape. Yet something held me back. The certainty that these exits were illusions, or worse, one-way journeys to places that only resembled the world I knew. Instead, I returned to the desk and studied the ledger more carefully. Each cycle seemed to involve a specific sequence of doors, a particular ordering that had to be followed. The patterns were complex, changing with each iteration, but discernible if one knew what to look for. And somehow, I did know. Buried beneath layers of confusion and forgotten repetitions, I recognized the pattern for this cycle, which doors to take, in which order, to complete whatever mysterious function the archives served. I began methodically, entering the leftmost door first. It led to a room filled with case files from the 1920s, which I dutifully organized according to an internal logic I didn't consciously understand, but somehow followed perfectly. Then the rightmost door, leading to a room of more recent cases, then the center. With each room completed, I returned to find fewer doors in the antechamber. 4, then 3, then 2, then 1. The footsteps behind me grew fainter, the flickering light steadied, and my reflection in the security monitor caught up to my actual movements, the delay shrinking with each completed task. When only one door remained, I hesitated before touching it. Beyond, I heard not street sounds, but the faint rustle of paper and the soft clicking of an old-fashioned typewriter. My office sounds, normal sounds. I pressed my palm against the surface, feeling warmth instead of cold. The door swung open to reveal a simple elevator. Not the service elevator I had descended in, but a modern one with a single button marked Lobby. As I stepped into it, a voice behind me, my voice but older, wearier, whispered, "Until next time." The elevator rose smoothly, the hum of its machinery comfortingly mundane after the impossible physics of the archives. When the doors opened, I found myself in the courthouse lobby, emerging from an elevator I had never noticed before, though I'd passed through this space hundreds of times in my career. The security guard nodded to me casually, checking his watch. "Working late again, Mr. Mercer? You only went down 20 minutes ago." 20 minutes. I checked my own watch. He was right. According to the world above, I had been in the archives for less than half an hour, not the hours or days my experience suggested. I mumbled something about finishing early and hurried out into the evening air, gulping it like a man rescued from drowning. Everything seemed normal, the same city I had always known, unchanged while I had been elsewhere. But as I walked to my car, I noticed something that froze me mid-step. My reflection in a darkened shop window showed not my face, but the aged version I had seen in the archives. It smiled at me with grim understanding before flickering back to my true appearance. And somewhere behind me, just at the edge of hearing, footsteps fell in perfect rhythm with my own, always the same distance back, never closing the gap. I drive home now, trying to convince myself it was all stress-induced hallucination. Tomorrow I'll call in sick. The day after, perhaps I'll resign from the firm entirely. But deep down, I know the truth. The archives are waiting. The cycle continues. And sometime soon I'll find myself descending once more, stepping into that hexagonal room with its 6 identical gray doors, or perhaps 5, or 4, depending on which cycle I'm in. And the lights will flicker in time with my heartbeat, marking the seconds until I fully understand my role in whatever ancient mechanism operates beneath the mundane facade of the county courthouse. Until then, I catalog my own experiences, filing them away like legal documents, searching for the pattern that might finally set me free. Story 13. The first night it happened, my fingertips were still raw from hours of planing Brazilian rosewood. Sawdust clung to the sweat on my forearms like a second skin, and the workshop air hung thick with the scent of lacquer and exotic timber. The silver-framed mirror I'd mounted that morning, a practical decision to amplify the meager lighting in my cluttered workshop, caught the last amber rays of sunset, casting unnaturally elongated shadows across my workbench. I remember thinking how wrong the angles looked, how the proportions of familiar tools suddenly seemed distorted in its reflection. But I dismissed the thought, attributing it to fatigue after 14 straight hours of crafting what was to be my masterpiece, a concert-grade acoustic guitar commissioned by a renowned virtuoso. I couldn't have known then that the mirror was already watching me, already listening, already learning the specific resonant frequency of my fear. I've been a luthier for 23 years. My hands have shaped wood into vessels of sound for nearly half my life, transforming dead timber into living instruments that sing with human-like voices. I understand wood in ways most people understand their lovers, its vulnerabilities, its strengths, how it responds to touch and temperature. This intimacy with my craft had always been my greatest pride. Now it's become my prison. The exotic woods are where it started. The ziracote, the bubinga, the flamed maple with grains so vibrant it seems to pulse under the finish. 3 days after installing the mirror, I was cutting thin sheets of Amazonian purple heart when I noticed something odd in the reflection. The wood's natural grain pattern, those intricate whorls and lines formed over decades of growth, were rearranging themselves when viewed in the mirror. Not dramatically at first, just subtle shifts that might be attributed to tricks of the light. But as I continued working, I couldn't ignore how the reflected grain began forming distinct patterns, connecting into what looked disturbingly like constellations I'd never seen in any astronomy book. I stepped closer to the mirror, Purple Heart veneer still in hand. The constellations moved, not with the jerky motion of optical illusion, but with deliberate glacial purpose. Stars shifting position over eons, compressed into seconds. My pulse quickened as one particular formation resembled something almost alphabetical, like a language written in stellar coordinates. I blinked hard, expecting the illusion to break. It didn't. Instead, something else changed. My own reflection stared back, sawdust-covered apron and all, but my eyes were wrong. Leaning in closer, my stomach dropped as I watched my pupils, both of them, split horizontally, dividing like cellular mitosis, until each eye contained two distinct pupils, rotating around each other in tiny, perfect orbits. I stumbled backward, dropping the veneer which clattered against the concrete floor. When I cautiously looked again, my reflection appeared normal, though a cold sweat had broken out across my forehead. That night, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination caused by exhaustion and wood dust irritation. Perhaps the chemical compounds in the exotic timbers, combined with inadequate ventilation, had triggered some sort of neurological response, a perfectly rational explanation. I even looked up the toxicity of Purple Heart sawdust online, finding that it can indeed cause respiratory and eye irritation. This temporary comfort allowed me sleep, though my dreams were filled with slow-moving stars and the sensation of being watched by something ancient and patient. The following week passed uneventfully. I worked mainly with domestic maple and spruce, and the mirror behaved like any normal reflective surface. My confidence returned, and I mentally filed away the strange incident as an isolated episode, likely caused by overwork and chemical sensitivities. Then came the Tuesday when a shipment of rare Honduran rosewood arrived, black as midnight with veins of deep burgundy running through each board like dried blood. As I began cutting the first piece on my bandsaw, I deliberately avoided looking at the mirror. But the workshop had become uncomfortably cold, despite the September heat outside, and I could feel pressure building in my ears, as if I were deep underwater. When I finally turned, the rosewood's reflection showed not wood grain, but what appeared to be vast, spiraling galaxies, slowly rotating and connecting with threads of luminous matter. I forced myself to continue working, though my hands trembled slightly, affecting the precision of my cuts. It was when I turned my back to the mirror that I first heard it, the unmistakable sound of guitar strings vibrating, though no instrument had been touched. The sound wasn't exactly audible. It was something felt more than heard, a subsonic vibration that resonated in my molars and sternum, like standing too close to a massive subwoofer. I spun around, but the workshop was empty. The half-dozen unfinished instruments hanging from the ceiling remained motionless, yet the vibration persisted, modulating slowly through frequencies too low for human ears, but perfectly calibrated to human bone. The sound, if it could be called that, conveyed a distinct impression of tuning, methodical adjustments seeking perfect pitch for some performance about to begin. But the concert never started. Instead, the tuning would continue for hours, occasionally reaching frequencies that made my vision blur and my nasal passages sting with the metallic scent of ozone. I contacted the antique dealer who had sold me the mirror, trying to keep my voice casual as I inquired about its provenance. He said it had come from an estate sale following the death of a physics professor who had specialized in acoustics and quantum mechanics. The professor, he mentioned in passing, had suffered from severe auditory hallucinations in his final years, insisting that he could hear the music of parallel dimensions. I thanked him and hung up, my mouth suddenly bone dry. That night, I covered the mirror with an old sheet, securing its edges with blue painter's tape. I slept soundly for the first time in days, waking refreshed and convinced I'd found a simple solution. But when I entered the workshop, the sheet lay neatly folded on my workbench, and the mirror gleamed as if freshly polished. No tape remained, no evidence it had ever been covered. I considered destroying it, but found myself unable to approach it with destructive intent. When I tried, my muscles seized with a paralyzing cramp that released only when I abandoned the idea. Instead, I began documenting the phenomena, setting up a small digital camera to record the mirror while I worked. The footage showed nothing unusual, just me working, the normal reflections of my movements, no constellations, no orbital pupils. Yet when I reviewed the audio, removing the visual element, I discovered something chilling. Beneath the normal workshop sounds were faint harmonics that, when isolated and amplified, formed complex mathematical patterns. A musicologist colleague later identified them as resembling shepherd tones, auditory illusions that seemed to continually ascend or descend in pitch without ever actually getting higher or lower. A sonic Escher staircase. My work began to suffer. Commissions fell behind schedule as I became obsessed with understanding what was happening. I started bringing different exotic woods into the workshop deliberately, testing which species triggered the strongest manifestations. African blackwood produced slow-moving constellations that seemed to form and reform into human facial features. Amboina burl from Southeast Asia created reflection patterns that resembled ancient cuneiform writing, but it was the combination of Brazilian rosewood and cocobolo that generated the most disturbing effect. My reflected pupils not only divided but multiplied exponentially until my eyes appeared to contain entire spiral galaxies of pupils, each one watching me with independent awareness. Sleep became elusive, my nights haunted by the subsonic frequencies that now followed me beyond the workshop, vibrating through the walls of my bedroom. I began to perceive them as a form of communication, though I couldn't decipher their meaning. Sometimes they seemed questioning, other times insistent, occasionally threatening. The house's wooden structure itself became a massive sounding board, amplifying these otherworldly transmissions. My physical condition deteriorated rapidly. Persistent nosebleeds stained my work shirts. Chronic tinnitus screamed in my ears whenever the subsonic vibrations temporarily ceased, making the silence even more unbearable than the strange tuning. Most alarming were the small splinters that began emerging from my fingertips, not embedded from woodworking, but growing outward from beneath my nails, composed of material that, when examined under a magnifying glass, displayed the same constellation patterns seen in the mirror's reflections. In desperation, I consulted a neurologist who found nothing physically wrong, suggesting instead that I might be experiencing a rare form of synesthesia triggered by prolonged exposure to the resinous compounds in exotic woods. The psychiatrist he referred me to nodded sympathetically while writing prescriptions for antipsychotics that did nothing except make it harder to concentrate on the increasingly insistent tuning sounds. Last night marked a turning point. After months of this escalating torment, I was applying a French polish to a nearly completed parlor guitar when I noticed something in the mirror I hadn't seen before. My reflection was working on a different instrument entirely. A strange, asymmetrical design I had contemplated but never actually built. The wood it used was unlike any terrestrial species, with impossible grain patterns that seemed to exist in more dimensions than our reality allows. Most disturbing was how my reflection occasionally paused to look directly at me, its movements no longer synchronized with my own. I backed away, pulse hammering in my throat, only to feel my right hand begin moving autonomously, reaching for a chisel without my conscious direction. My fingers, now significantly elongated and wooden in texture, gripped the tool with unfamiliar precision. I fought against this possession, finally regaining control by plunging my hand into a bucket of ice water I use for bending wood. The shock broke whatever connection had been established, but left my hand numb and discolored, with fine grain patterns visible beneath the skin. This morning, I made a discovery that has forced me to accept the impossible nature of my situation. The mirror isn't reflecting light. It's a permeable boundary between dimensions. The constellation patterns aren't illusions, but navigational charts mapping transit points between realities. The subsonic tuning isn't preparation for a concert, but calibration of vibrational frequencies necessary for matter to pass between worlds. I've sealed the workshop door with epoxy resin and have begun the process of destroying all my exotic wood inventory. The native maple and pine seem to dampen the mirror's influence, possibly due to their simpler molecular structures or their indigenous resonance with our local reality. I'm writing this account as documentation, in case I'm unable to resolve this intrusion successfully. The most terrifying revelation came an hour ago. While examining the small splinters still protruding from my fingertips, I realized they were actually tiny tuning pegs, identical to those used on stringed instruments. Looking more closely at my arms under strong light, I can now see the faint outlines of strings running beneath my skin from wrist to shoulder, gradually becoming more defined as whatever exists on the other side continues its methodical tuning. I understand now. I'm not just witnessing this phenomenon. I'm being transformed into an instrument myself. A living conduit designed to amplify something trying to resonate its way into our world. Even as I write these words, I can feel the strings inside my arms tightening incrementally, approaching their ideal tension. My bones vibrate in response to each adjustment, producing tones that make the mirror's surface ripple like disturbed water. The tuning is nearly complete. Soon the concert will begin, though whether I'll be the musician or the instrument remains unclear. Perhaps both simultaneously. I've positioned myself facing away from the mirror, but I can feel its presence behind me, patient and expectant. The final note is being calibrated now, a perfect fifth that makes my vision fracture into prismatic layers. I will not turn around again. I will not complete the circuit between worlds. Even as my transformed hands try to betray me, pulling toward the silver frame with magnetic urgency, I resist. This will be my final act of human will before the music begins. The concert that never starts is about to reach its crescendo. Story 14. Whispers in the undertow. The first time I heard my full name echo through those forgotten tunnels, I convinced myself it was just the water dripping against rusted pipes, just my mind playing tricks after too many hours underground. Daniel Matthias Colston, a name I hadn't used since my divorce 6 years ago, when I reverted to my birth surname, Harmon. Yet there it was, slithering through the darkness, finding me where no one should know me. I've been mapping the drainage system beneath Millbrook for 3 years now. Urban archaeology isn't glamorous work, but there's something about peeling back the layers of a city's hidden infrastructure that satisfies me in ways conventional archaeology never could. Most people walk these streets oblivious to the labyrinth beneath their feet. Tunnels dating back to the 1700s, forgotten waterways diverted by urban expansion, remnants of industrial machinery abandoned when newer systems replaced them. History, buried but not dead. This particular network had been my focus for months. City records indicated an auxiliary drainage system built in the 1880s, but modern maps showed nothing beyond the main channels. Perfect. Unexplored territory. I'd made significant headway documenting the primary arteries when I discovered a narrow offshoot hidden behind a half-collapsed wall. The brickwork appeared different, older, with unfamiliar mason marks I hadn't encountered in any other section. My headlamp barely penetrated the oppressive darkness as I squeezed through the gap. The air grew noticeably colder, heavy with mineral scents and something else, something organic and vaguely maritime. My boots splashed through ankle-deep water, each step producing echoes that lingered unnaturally long in the tunnel. Unusual acoustics, I told myself. Just unusual acoustics. After 20 minutes of careful progress, the passage widened into a circular chamber approximately 30 feet in diameter. My light swept across the space, revealing brick walls covered in a slick, black substance that glistened like oil, but didn't smell petroleum-based. Water trickled down from various points in the ceiling, collecting in channels that converged toward a central depression. But what immediately captured my attention was the large water wheel mounted on the far wall, a cast iron relic at least 12 feet in diameter. I approached it slowly, confused by its placement. This chamber showed no signs of being a mill room, and the water flow was minimal at best. Yet as I drew closer, I noticed something impossible. The wheel was turning. Slowly, deliberately, perhaps one revolution every minute. Each rotation produced a soft metallic groan like steel under stress. I checked for air currents, found none. Examined the water flow, far too insignificant to power this mechanism. Yet it continued its patient rotation, defying explanation. I stepped closer, aiming my light at the mechanism, when I heard it. A whispered voice emanating from the wheel itself as it completed another revolution. Daniel Matthias Colston. My full, abandoned name, articulated with perfect clarity in the moment the wheel's apex reached its lowest point. My heart lurched against my ribcage, mouth instantly dry. I swept my light around the chamber, convinced someone was playing an elaborate prank. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, fogging in the unusually cold air. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice bounced back at me, distorted and wrong, like someone had caught it, changed it slightly, and then released it. I reached for my phone to document the wheel, only to find no signal and a rapidly draining battery, despite being fully charged when I entered the tunnels. Standard procedure demanded I retreat, report the find, and return with a team. That's what I should have done. Instead, I found myself transfixed by the wheel, by its impossible movement, by the voice that shouldn't know that name. Forcing myself to be methodical, I approached the wall to the right of the wheel. My light revealed markings I initially mistook for mineral deposits or mold patterns. Upon closer inspection, they were drawings, crude but unmistakably intentional. Human silhouettes rendered in what appeared to be black chalk, dozens of them arranged in concentric circles. Each figure had lines extending upward from their limbs, converging at the ceiling. Puppet strings. I touched one figure, and my fingertips came away with a powdery residue that smelled faintly of ash. The wheel completed another rotation. Daniel Matthias Colston. My name again, but this time I felt it physically. A vibration that traveled up my spine and settled at the base of my skull. Cold sweat trickled down my back despite the chill. I tried to dismiss it as an acoustic phenomenon, some quirk of the chamber's construction creating a pareidolia effect, making random sounds seem like words. But the precision, the clarity, it left no room for misinterpretation. I moved toward the wheel, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't articulate. The central depression in the floor now seemed deeper than I'd initially observed, a perfect circle perhaps 6 feet across. My light didn't penetrate its depth. The beam seemed to dissipate a few feet down, consumed by an unnatural darkness. As I neared the edge of this pit, a gust of wind erupted from below, intensely cold and carrying the unmistakable scent of salt water, seaweed, and the distinctive tar and rot smell of old wooden docks. Impossible. Millbrook sat nearly 50 miles inland, yet my senses filled with maritime impressions so vivid, I could almost hear distant foghorns and the creak of moorings. My light flickered, dimmed, then stabilized. In that momentary darkness, I felt something brush against my ankle, gentle as spider silk, but unnervingly deliberate. I jerked backward, nearly losing my balance. When I aimed my light downward, the water around my boots appeared undisturbed, yet I couldn't shake the sensation of contact. The wheel turned again. My name whispered forth, but this time followed by something else. Come back to us. My chest constricted, lungs struggling against the suddenly thick air. Rational explanations dissolved into primitive fear. I stumbled backward, keeping my eyes on the wheel, which now seemed to rotate slightly faster. The drawings on the wall appeared to shift in my peripheral vision, though they remained static when directly observed. I needed to leave. Every instinct screamed retreat. Yet when I turned toward the tunnel entrance, I found myself disoriented. Where I expected to see the passage, I instead faced another section of wall covered in those puppet-like figures. I spun around, confused and increasingly panicked. The chamber now seemed perfectly circular with no obvious exit. My headlamp dimmed further, its beam barely penetrating 10 feet ahead. The battery shouldn't be failing this quickly. I reached for my backup light, fumbling it from my pack with trembling hands. When it clicked on, its beam revealed something I hadn't noticed before. The floor had a subtle pattern, concentric circles etched into the stone, mirroring the arrangement of figures on the walls. Standing at what I believed to be the original entrance point, I forced myself to breathe slowly, close my eyes, visualize the path I'd taken. When I opened them again, I identified what might be the tunnel, a slightly darker section of wall. As I moved toward it, the wheel accelerated its rotation, the whispers becoming more urgent, overlapping like multiple voices now speaking in unison. Daniel Matthias Colston, return. Below. Remember. My foot connected with something solid in the water. Aiming my light downward, I saw a small metallic object, a pocket watch. Its case tarnished almost black with age. Something about it struck me as familiar. Without thinking, I picked it up, its weight substantial in my palm. The front bore an engraved design, a wheel identical to the one on the wall. When I pressed the clasp, it opened with surprising ease. Inside, where I expected a clock face, I found a miniature version of the chamber I stood in, rendered in exquisite detail, complete with a tiny figurine positioned exactly where I stood. The craftsmanship was impossible, the detail beyond what could be achieved at such scale. My hand convulsed involuntarily, nearly dropping the watch. The wheel's rotation had increased to perhaps one revolution every 15 seconds, generating a rhythmic creaking that synchronized with my heartbeat. The wind from the central pit intensified, carrying not just the smell of the sea but also whispered fragments I couldn't quite discern. I managed to locate the tunnel entrance and lunge toward it, splashing through water that now seemed to resist my movement, as if thickened to the consistency of oil. The watch remained clutched in my hand, impossibly warm against my skin. Just as I reached the passage, my primary light failed completely, leaving me with only the weaker backup. Behind me, the wheel's rotation became audibly faster, the metallic groan transforming into something like laughter. The wind from the pit rose to a howl, and I felt something tug at my jacket, a sharp jerk that nearly pulled me backward. I broke into a run, no longer concerned with documenting my path or preserving the archaeological integrity of the site. The tunnel seemed longer returning, twisting in ways I didn't remember, branching where I recalled no intersections. My backup light flickered ominously. In the momentary darkness between flickers, I glimpsed movement along the walls, puppet figures animated just beyond the reach of consistent observation. The watch in my hand grew warmer still, almost hot enough to burn. When my light flickered again, I glanced down at it and saw the tiny figurine inside had moved, now positioned in the tunnel rather than the chamber. My stomach lurched with vertigo, the sense that I was simultaneously in the tunnel and inside the watch, looking at myself. After what seemed like hours but must have been minutes, I spotted the collapsed wall that marked my original entry point. The relief nearly buckled my knees. I squeezed through the gap, tearing my jacket and scraping my shoulder raw against the bricks, emerging into the main drainage tunnel where my documentation equipment remained. I didn't stop to collect it. The compulsion to escape overrode everything else. I splashed through the main tunnel toward the access point half a mile ahead, the sound of running water no longer soothing but threatening. My backup light dimmed to a yellowish glow barely sufficient to prevent collision with the tunnel walls. When I finally reached the access ladder and emerged through the manhole into an alley behind Millbrook's old textile district, the late afternoon sun nearly blinded me. I collapsed against a brick wall, gulping air that had never tasted so sweet, checking my phone to find it completely dead. Only then did I realize I still clutched the watch. In daylight, it looked different, not tarnished, but made of some dark metal with bluish undertones I couldn't identify. The engraving remained, but now appeared more nautical than industrial, the wheel resembling a ship's helm. When I opened it again, the miniature chamber had transformed into a conventional clock face, though the hands moved counterclockwise at an accelerated pace. 3 days have passed. I've told no one about what happened, though I drafted and discarded numerous emails to colleagues who might make sense of the experience. The watch sits on my desk as I write this, its hands still moving in reverse, counting down to something I don't understand. I've researched the tunnels extensively, finding nothing about a chamber or water wheel in any historical record. Last night I dreamed of the wheel. In the dream, I understood its purpose, not to harness the water's power, but to regulate something kept below. Something that knows the name I abandoned. Something that remembers me, even though I have no memory of it. The most disturbing development. This morning I noticed a new marking on my ankle, where I felt that touch underwater. A small circular scar I've never seen before, lined with what look like stitch marks. When I press it, I taste salt on my tongue, and hear, very faintly, the sound of waves against a shore. I've decided to return to the tunnels tomorrow. Not alone. I've convinced a colleague to accompany me, though I've told him only that I discovered an unusual structural feature worth documenting. We'll bring proper equipment, lights with fresh batteries, cameras. As I write these final lines, I realize something that chills me more than any supernatural explanation. Part of me is eager to go back. Beneath the fear lies a pull I can't explain, a sense that whatever waits in that chamber isn't unknown to me at all, but painfully familiar. Something I've spent years hiding from, even from myself. The watch ticks backward on my desk. In certain angles of light, I can see tiny figures moving behind the glass. Sometimes, when I hold it to my ear, I hear my full name whispered with something like longing. Daniel Matthias Colston. A name I abandoned, but perhaps never escaped. Maybe none of us ever truly escapes what lies beneath.